Welcome you all today. I would like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on which we stand, the Wadandi people, and that of all our speakers today in all their locations. And thank you all for coming, and I hope we get a great deal out of today. I've got a few speakers lined up and they'll pop in as they turn up. And yeah, I'll let you lead off. Julian's from Wine Australia. He's been with Wine Australia for a couple of months now, but previously he led the team that put together the roadmap to emissions reduction for Wine Australia. So he is all over carbon and what it's all about. So thank you so much for joining us today, Julian.
Thanks for having me. I'll just pull up my PowerPoint and we'll go from there. Perfect. Can you all see that?
Yeah.
Yep. Okay. Great. Thanks for the introduction. My remit today is really to talk about the setting of emissions reduction and where that fits within global ESG reporting and disclosures. So I'd like to talk a little bit about the drivers of sustainability reporting and what's happening from a global perspective, but also within Australia. Have a discussion around what a sustainable Australian wine sector may look like, and talk about some of the basics of carbon accounting and greenhouse gas emissions. And that'll lead a little bit into some of the findings from the emissions reduction roadmap, and some of the future plans that, from a Wine Australia perspective, I'd really like to focus on to help build the skills and knowledge so that people are aware of what carbon accounting is and they're able to conduct their own carbon accounting. It's not as hard as you think it is, particularly for scope 1 and 2. There is some complexity with scope 3, but I think there's opportunities there for people to apply the skills that they learn and apply that also from a carbon insetting perspective as well, to understand the options that are available if you're growing grapes. So if we look at the global drivers of change, typically when we see sustainability promoted, we see images like this, and it doesn't really tell a story of what's happening behind the scenes. We see all these pictures of green, lovely flora, but in reality, sustainability is now, it's considered a business risk. It's also an opportunity, and it's a market access matter, and it's data driven. So if you're not recording data, or you don't have some form of evidence to prove what you're doing, you're not addressing your sustainability risks. And this has become more and more of a focus, particularly for retailers. And I'll talk a little bit about the reasons for that. So we see a lot of focus around sustainability issues are more present in the media. Modern slavery is one of those. There's also a lot of discussion around extreme weather events that are driven by climate change and the financial, the health impacts of those. Also from an insurance perspective, there are areas now through parts of the US which are uninsurable, and this is a direct result of more extreme events driven by climate change. We're also seeing a rise in the amount of plastics that have ever been in the world, and this is causing microplastics. So as a society, I think we're more aware of these global issues, these environmental and social issues which are affecting us. And the way that businesses are responding to that is that they're seeing this through a risk lens. So how will climate change affect my business now and into the future? And if you're investing into a company, you also have a right to know what your exposure is to any risk, but particularly from a climate change perspective and how that may impact on your financial returns. So we're seeing this rise in ESG reporting, which has been primarily driven through the financial sector, and now it's hitting other parts and other industries.
Julian?
Yeah?
You're still on your first slide. You're aware of that?
I'm still on my first slide?
Yeah, the slideshow hasn't.
Okay, it's moving on mine.
Okay, yeah, we're still on. Yeah, it's the slideshow hasn't started from our side. It's just the single slide, and we can see the rest down the side.
Right. Okay. That's unusual.
So that's on for a second now.
So can you see that? Is that changing for you?
We can see the second slide, agenda, as then the rest are down the side on the left-hand side.
Okay.
Sally Jarvis here. We're just seeing your working PowerPoint, not it from the slideshow perspective.
Okay. You're not saying.
That's still
So,
the same.
yeah. So if I go into slideshow mode, you're not saying that?
No.
Right, yeah, that one.
Top left, yeah.
Top
Sorry?
left
From the top left, from beginning, under file.
Yeah,
Yeah.
from. Are you seeing that?
No.
Yeah, that's odd. Maybe I'll just do it from within, if I can. If I move through like that, is that large enough for you to see?
Yes,
Yeah.
thank you.
Okay. Yeah, that's a bit frustrating. So, I mean, the main point here is that the world is changing, that we're now seeing non-financial metrics needing to be disclosed and reported by organisations which weren't traditionally captured. So if we looked at traditional methods of reporting how I own a business success, it was purely driven by financial metrics. And what we're seeing now is that consumers, they want to know more about the environmental impacts of a product and also those social impacts. And so we're seeing a rise in the amount of companies reporting on sustainability. And to a large extent, up until about 12 months ago or 18 months ago, the manner in which they reported was varied because there were multiple reporting systems occurring. And so you couldn't compare apples with apples. You're always comparing one company's disclosures to another, and they were using completely different frameworks to report what they've done. And we now know that what's been really promising within Australia is that there's been a standardisation of these sustainability frameworks, and I'll talk about those in a little while. But the point here is that we're seeing large companies are having to disclose what they're doing. They're having to collect data to support that. And if they don't have the data to do so, they need some alternative form of evidence. And that is often a policy, or it may be driven by a plan. It may be that they report on something with qualitative data rather than quantitative. But 99% of the US top 100 largest companies are reporting sustainability, and 90% of the ASX 100 are now reporting sustainability and carbon targets. We're also seeing an increase in the recognition of environmental risks from a global risk perspective. So the World Economic Forum every year puts out a global risk report. This is looking at they interview almost 1,500 people across the world. And this is really focused on what do they see as the short-term risks within a 2-year timeframe and the longer-term 10-year risks. And you can see that from a short-term time frame, all the green The risks in green, they represent the environmental risks. The risks in red are the societal risks. And you can see, if we look at the 10-year time frame, these people are really concerned around environmental risks, particularly extreme weather events, which are driven by climate change, and critical changes to the Earth system, which is another response from climate change. So in response to this, governments have been acting, particularly through the European Union. There's the European Union Green Deal incorporates a number of different policy settings. And the ones which are most relevant to the Australian grape and wine sector are really the European Corporate Sustainability Due Diligence Directive and the Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive. And so the reporting standards really, they mandate that the largest companies operating in Europe have to report on sustainability. And in addition to this, they also have to conduct due diligence assessments through their own operations and their supply chains to make sure that they are avoiding things like modern slavery, that they are not contributing to things like deforestation, and generally disclosing how the products or the services that they offer impact on the environment and the measures that they're taking to try and reduce those impacts over time. And what this means is that those large companies, they can't do this without the support of their supply chain. So they reach out to their supply chain and they ask for information. And we're also seeing, just 2 weeks ago, the Australian Sustainability Reporting Standards passed the Senate, which means from the 1st of January next year, companies initially who are earning $500 million or more in revenue and who have 500 employees or more, or have consolidated assets of more than $1 billion, are required to disclose their scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions and to report on their climate risk. And they also need to develop plans to decarbonise, so reduce their emissions and mitigate those climate risks. And those, while it's initially starting with the biggest businesses in Australia, those financial employee numbers and asset thresholds are decreasing over time, so that by the time we get to 27, 28, any organisation with $25 million in revenue will now be required to support. So will be required to report, sorry. So what that means is that large organisations will be reaching out to their supply chain to find out what the companies that they're buying from are doing to address climate change. In addition to this, you'll see that most of the largest companies in the world, there's almost 5,000 companies in the world that are committed to science-based targets. Science-based targets ask a company to reduce their emissions in line with a well below 2-degree warming scenario. So this is something that's come out of the Paris Agreement. You may have heard of the COP, or the Conference of Parties, where governments and big business get together and they talk about how they're going to reduce emissions across the world. As in response to that, a lot of organisations, including Coles, including Woolworths, Tesco's is a signatory to it. Most of the large supermarkets across the world are signatories to science-based targets. And that means that they are not only trying to decarbonise their own operations, but also reaching out to their supply chain again and asking their supply chain, saying, if you want to sell to us, we want you to tell us how you're helping us contribute to our climate commitments. What are you doing within your own operations to reduce emissions? So a materiality assessment is normally the main vehicle for determining those priority topics from an ESG lens on what you report. So it looks at what's called an outside-in focus, where you're looking at how the resources and the people that we have can contribute to creating a financially viable business, but also looking at, from an inside out perspective, how our business impacts people and the environment. And if you put that on a matrix, and I'll show you some examples later on of what that looks like for some companies, it basically provides you a prioritization tool that highlights your key areas that you should be focused on. And so why this matters to the grape and wine sector is that you can go into most organizations, most large organizations publicly disclose their materiality assessment. So you could go, if you wanted to sell wine into Sweden, say, you could go into Systembolagets ESG strategy, and you can have a look at their materiality assessment, and it will tell you exactly what they value. And that helps you as a business to align what you're doing to that of your customer. So I've talked about this a little bit already, but this table captures the EU Corporate Sustainability Reporting Standards and Due Diligence Directive, and what that means. So again, you can see, similar to Australia, with initially the legislation is set up to target the biggest businesses first. Then once the biggest businesses have embedded these systems and processes, it then tiers down to the next set of businesses, and then keeps tiering down to more and more businesses are captured through these frameworks. And this is all publicly available. You can have a look at this. This is the European Union Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive. And you'll see that under the environment, the first reporting requirement is climate change, and understandably so. So you can expect, if you are wanting to sell wines into the European Union to large businesses, that they're going to expect some type of information in relation to climate change. So what does a Australian wine sector look like? A sustainable Australian wine sector look like? For me, I think we need to focus on the economic picture first. I think we often get caught up in the social and environmental, but we know that it's very important for business to be economically viable before they can look at environmental and social outcomes. So being profitable, receiving fair prices, and looking at long-term growth, or at least stability within the system. And from an environmental perspective, energy and greenhouse gas emissions is the number one requirement which is asked for by customers, wine customers, followed by things like they're really interested in sustainable packaging. This is not just looking at how that product is disposed of, but where it's sourced from. Biodiversity is an emerging issue as well, and nature dependency, best practice management, and then I've put climate change in there, and that really is speaking to the adaptation resilience piece rather than trying to reduce emissions. From a social perspective, the number one issue for most businesses is human rights. If you look within Australia, there's modern slavery legislation within New South Wales and nationally. That at this stage within New South Wales, it covers any business with a revenue of $50 million or more. Nationally, that's 100 million. There is talk that the federal legislation may be reduced to 50 million so that it's standardised across New South Wales and the rest of the country. But that requires organisations to disclose their risk to modern slavery and their reporting mechanisms, and also any mechanisms they have for rooting it at its source. And we know that DEI, diversity, equity and inclusion, is more important for businesses in the future. And from a governance perspective, health and safety is key. Information disclosure is all what I've been talking about today, and it's a big part of sustainability is disclosing your failures, but also your successes. And there's also things like looking at the makeup of boards from a diversity perspective. So to give you some really high level information around greenhouse gas emissions and carbon accounting, I thought I'd start off with a slide looks at perception versus reality. And I think there's a perception out there that calculating greenhouse gas emissions is difficult, and it can be for certain sections, for certain areas, but most businesses can calculate scope 1 and 2 just using information like how much natural gas you've used in a year, how much electricity you've consumed, and the fuel that you've consumed in a year. That will be, for most organisations, that's the majority of their scope 1 and 2, and it's really easy to calculate. And the way that you can do that or learn more about it is through the National Greenhouse Account Factors, which are Australian government document. They're updated every year, and it basically produces emissions factors for materials, but also for resources within Australia. And so you can look at how the electricity grid in Western Australia compares, in say Southwest Western Australia compares to the electricity grid in South Australia, compared to Victoria, compared to New South Wales. And within the National Greenhouse Account Factors, there are also examples of how you calculate emissions. So this document is a really useful tool if you want to learn more about carbon accounting. I'd recommend having a look, and you can just Google it. The other thing that I wanted to address as well, sometimes we hear that climate change isn't real or it's not as bad as it's reported. What I can tell you is that carbon dioxide levels remain under 300 parts per million for 1 billion years, and they've increased by 25% in just 140 years. So something is occurring that is producing more emissions and I, for one, believe it's led by human-induced climate change. So if we look at the carbon cycle, and apologies if this diagram is a bit small on your screen, basically carbon is the fourth most abundant element in the Earth. So it exists within living beings, it exists within the oceans, within soils, within the atmosphere, within minerals, and it transfers from one to the other pretty much in harmony, as long as we're not pulling out fossil fuels from the ground and burning them, or clearing huge areas of land which had previously stored a lot of carbon. If we could avoid those two things, we'd pretty much address climate change. So greenhouse gas emissions, this term's used a lot, and it's often, you hear greenhouse gas emissions interchanged with carbon. Carbon is one of many greenhouse gas emissions. There are 7 main greenhouse gas emissions. Water vapor is one of those, and we all know that if you travel closer to the equator, it starts to get a lot warmer because of the moisture in the air, the humidity. Carbon dioxide is one which is produced a lot through the grape and wine production sector. Methane, primarily arising from things like landfills, landfill and cattle. Nitrous oxide, we all know that's a result of fertilizer use. And then we have things like hydrocarbons, perfluorocarbons, and sulfur hexafluoride. Now, all of these gases, they have a different global warming potential. So say if you take carbon dioxide, 1 molecule of carbon dioxide is not equivalent to 1 molecule of methane, because methane has a global warming potential 28 times that of carbon dioxide, and nitrous oxide is 273 times that of carbon dioxide. So not all greenhouse gases are the same. However, we have a common metric that we use, which is called carbon dioxide equivalent. It's represented by the symbol CO2e. So if you ever see that symbol, all that it means is that someone behind the scenes has calculated the total emissions, factoring in the different types of greenhouse gases, and converted it to this common metric. In terms of the terms that are used, carbon neutral, I'm sure everyone's heard of that term. It's basically a balancing of the amount of emissions put into the atmosphere with the amount taken away. It's the most simplest way that I can put it. You often hear it interchanged with the term net zero. It means the same thing effectively, but net zero is normally applied to a country or a sector or a region. From an Australian government perspective, carbon neutrality is achieved through the Climate Active label, and it can be applied to an organisation or an individual product. Some organisations choose to have products which are, maybe the organisation isn't carbon neutral, but a product line is. It can be applied to a precinct or a neighbourhood, a service, a building, or an event. And there are many ways that, from Australian government perspective, that offsets can be purchased. And offsets are basically, they don't always, we often hear the term offsets applied to agriculture or people planting trees. You can also purchase offsets for things like money that goes into funding wind farms, or you could pay a landfill organisation to install infrastructure to flare their methane and convert it to carbon dioxide. Or it's things like fire management, particularly up in the northern part of Australia. They do controlled burns to reduce fuel loads. That is considered a emissions reduction activity. So you can pay for a variety of different activities through offsetting. Now, you might have heard me before talk about Scope 1, Scope 2, and Scope 3. Scope 1 is direct emissions. So it's things like you put fertiliser onto your grapevines, and perhaps some of that fertiliser stays in the root zone, some might leach through to the soils below, and some of it might volatilize and turn into nitrous oxide. It's things like anytime you jump in a petrol or diesel powered car and turn it on. It's also things like refrigeration. So gases from refrigeration units, doesn't matter whether that's air conditioners or commercial refrigeration or your fridge at home, they all leak a little bit. And those gases that are traditionally used in refrigeration systems, some of them aren't harmful from a climate perspective. You'd say take something like ammonia, it tends to be very environmentally friendly, as opposed to something like Freon, which has a high global warming potential. Scope 2. Scope 2 is the only thing included within Scope 2 is purchased electricity. So it looks at, there are a couple of different ways of calculating your emissions from electricity. One way is to look at the electricity grid that you're purchasing it from and saying what is the mix of fossil fuels versus renewables in this grid over an average year, and you apply that to the electricity that you've consumed. Another way to do it is a market-based method, and that looks at whether you are purchasing renewable electricity, whether that's 10% or 100% as part of your electricity contract. Then there's this category called Scope 3, and Scope 3, according to the Greenhouse Gas Protocol, which is the framework which most organisations use to measure emissions, there are 15 categories within Scope 3. The biggest of those is your supply chain. So everything that you buy within your financial year period has a carbon footprint, and we can calculate rough estimates really on what your carbon profile might look like through your supply chain based on what you're buying. And for most organisations, that's where the majority of their emissions sit, is within their supply chain. And when I say most, for businesses outside of agriculture, forestry, mining, most of their emissions sit 80, 90, sometimes 95% of their emissions sit in their supply chain. So it's the things that they are buying. So from a carbon management perspective, we always talk about the first thing to do if you have no idea about carbon accounting is to baseline. Just understand at least what your Scope 1 and 2 are. Conduct the calculations, like I said, through the National Greenhouse Account Factors. You can access publicly available information, and it'll basically tell you how to do that. You can then look to reduce. So if you understand where your emissions are arising from within your business, you can look to reduce. You can look to replace. So perhaps you're looking to replace infrastructure which uses a lot of emissions. It might be really, or produces a lot of emissions. It might be a really inefficient pump or an inefficient refrigeration process within the winery. Then you can look at insetting from a perspective, if you own a bit of land, you can look at how you could increase the amount of carbon stored through your soils or through planting trees on your property, and how much of the emissions that you're producing through your business can be inset through what you're doing within the vineyard. Outside of that, organisations that once they can't reduce anymore, they look to offset, and that's paying someone else to either plant trees or flare methane from a landfill or conduct controlled burns, or perhaps funding an offshore wind farm in India. So from the perspective of scope 1, 2 and 3, when we conducted the emissions roadmap for the Australian wine sector, what we found is that 80% of the sector's emissions are scope 3, 14% are scope 2, and just 6% are scope 1. And what this really means is we're factoring in everything from grape production right through to the disposal of a wine bottle by the consumer who may be sitting in London. And you can imagine that a lot of the emissions, the majority of the emissions, really occur from transportation of wine and also from the packaging that we use. Glass is a very energy intensive product and has a high carbon footprint. And so anytime we put something into glass, the carbon impact of that is very high, which is why if we look at lightweighting of glass, it has such a huge, profound impact on the carbon emissions of any wine product. And the main sources from a scope 1 perspective is direct vineyard and winery emissions, is really from fuel use, things like putting fuel into tractors. It's fertilizer use, it's wastewater management. So emissions arise from wastewater management systems, particularly pools and ponds. It's refrigerant use. We've talked about purchased electricity in scope 2, and then scope 3, the main sources are transportation and distribution, packaging. We looked at waste produced within wineries. Employee commuting is considered within scope 3. The indirect emissions from fossil fuel use is considered within scope 3, and goods and services as well. And I might skip the next slide. So from a business perspective, it's really difficult to control scope 3. It often sits outside, it sits with your suppliers. So if we look at what we can control, what we can influence, and what's within our concern, scope 3 is within our concern, and you can make decisions within the business, like you can choose to purchase lightweight glass, or you could choose to package your product in something alternative to glass. Those are decisions for a business, and they need to be balanced amongst other factors that you need to consider. But really, you want to be focusing on energy efficiency. So anytime that you can align cost savings, business efficiencies with reducing emissions, this is really the win-win scenario. There's also opportunities with renewable electricity generation on farm. A pretty simple thing to do, but it can be expensive. But when it's time to upgrade refrigeration systems or even re-gas refrigeration systems, it is possible to do some work and work with your refrigeration mechanics on utilising lower global warming potential refrigerants, because some of them if I take a gas, say like sulfur hexafluoride, which is used in the brake lines of things like trains, that has a global warming potential over 23,000 times more than that of carbon dioxide. So even though the leakage rate from this might be low, global warming potential is really high. So from a winery perspective, if you can replace high global warming potential refrigerants, it can have quite an impact. Then it's really looking at electrification. If we can move away from fossil fuels towards and electrify everything, it will drastically reduce our emissions. And the reasons for that is that because we have a mix of both fossil fuels and renewables within every electricity grid within Australia. And particularly, we know that, say, in Western Australia, the state government has plans to increase, and they're putting a lot of money into renewable energy. So the mix is likely to become more and more heavily dominated by renewables and battery systems. So I'll give you a bit of a background on the Australian wine sector emissions reduction roadmap. Basically, we conducted a baseline assessment to calculate the carbon footprint of the sector. We determined the greatest opportunities for emissions reduction, and we modelled the impact of implementing those emissions over time. And that allowed us to develop a sector target and also a pathway on how we achieve this. So what it showed is that transport makes up almost a third of emissions. Industrial processes and supply chain, which sits mainly in the packaging space, is almost half of the emissions. 12% of emissions arise from the winery and 10% from the vineyard. And often I think the message here is that people see that if we look at the whole supply chain, there's not a huge percentage of emissions arising from the winery or the vineyard. While that's true, as I talked about before, those large organisations, the customers that you're likely selling to, they have their own decarbonisation plans, and anything that you can do to help them meet their targets is good for your business as well. So I think there's an imperative to do something from a moral perspective, but also it makes business sense to start reducing emissions, and there are a lot of cost savings to be had as well. So the key issues, and these are things that we don't necessarily control, is looking at how emissions will change within the freight sector, within logistics, within transport, and within the glass sector. What we know is that, say, an organisation like Aurora, who produces a large percentage of Australia's wine bottles, they are covered by the safeguard mechanism, which means that they need to publicly disclose their greenhouse gas emissions every year, and they need to align their emissions reduction efforts to the Australian government target of a 43% reduction by 2030 from 2005. So these organisations, they are decarbonising. You can see that they're doing it. They have plans to further decarbonise. And this is really important because you'll see that those numbers start to shift. If vineyards and wineries aren't reducing their emissions, you'll see that the percentage of emissions produced through the wine supply chain for vineyards and wineries will start to increase as we see decarbonisation of glass and also the freight sector, because we know that there's a lot of effort going into how we decarbonise transport across the world. Within the vineyard, roughly half of emissions are arising from electricity use. 42% is from fuel sources, and 9% is from fertilizer use. Within the winery, it's predominantly electricity use. There is some emissions arising from refrigerant gases and fossil fuel sources as well. So as I said, electrify everything is one of the main ways that we can reduce our emissions over time. So what do we need to do? In a nutshell, we're using data to inform our emissions reduction decisions. So we're understanding where our emissions hotspots are, which means the areas which are producing the greatest amount of emissions and what we can do to reduce. We're focusing on eliminating fossil fuels. That's the end goal, at least reducing in the meantime. There's a focus on operating efficient production sites powered by renewable electricity and optimizing low emissions transport and distribution networks. And of course, collaboration is key. So this may be hard to see, but this is the pathway that we've mapped for the Australian wine sector. Under a do-nothing scenario, we modelled that the sector is shrinking. There's a premiumisation occurring within the sector, but in terms of the volume of wine produced, it's less by 2030 compared to 2021. So under a do-nothing scenario, the emissions are expected to drop just because we're producing less wine as a country. Now, if you look at the big opportunities, some of these you don't need to do anything. It's things like grid decarbonisation. Every state government in Australia is investing heavily in renewables and battery storage technology. And this will, without having to do anything, it just means the electricity that we're using will become more and more powered by renewable sources. And when we modelled that, it looks like 159,000, almost 160,000 tonnes of emissions can be avoided just through the decarbonisation of every state electricity grid. The other big opportunities are reduced emissions road transport, the purchase of 100% renewable electricity, things like lower energy glass production are the big ones. But we have modelled several others which are specific to vineyards and wineries within there as well. But what it basically shows is that there's a possibility of a 42% reduction by 2030. And the aim is, the target is very much to reach net zero by 2050. So some work will be conducted in 2025 and 2027, 28 to update this roadmap to see where we're sitting. And hopefully it shows that we are reducing our emissions over time as a sector. So if you'd like to know more, more information is available on the Wine Australia website. You'll see there's a sustainability tab up the top when you log into the website. A drop-down menu will appear. You can click on the emissions reduction roadmap, and you'll see that there are 3 resources for viewing here. If I didn't know anything about emissions and I wanted to start somewhere, I'd have a look at the emissions reduction guide. I think that's important. So this is really resources that are there for you to use. There's also a guide to carbon accounting tools, and it'll show you some free sources of carbon accounting tools. That space is changing as well. We're likely to have more, not just carbon accounting tools, but environmental platforms which are available to us in time. And I'll talk about that in a minute. So the future plans, and I really looked at it from a problems and opportunities perspective. Markets are changing. So this is requiring wine labels to provide non-financial information and meet sustainability requirements. So why this is important? It's important because we need to move with this changing tide, and we need to increase the knowledge and skills of those within the sector to respond to this. And so one of my goals is to have several programs. They're all focused on skills and knowledge. One of them is specifically around emissions reduction. It's going to look at insetting and offsetting. Other plans are looking at how we communicate sustainability and how we capture information from a data perspective, because if we look at what we need to disclose and what we capture, there's often a gap. So it's trying to bridge that gap of how do we capture this data and how do we communicate that in a way that has meaning to our customers. we know that calculating emissions can be confusing and complex. So part of this is the aim is to build carbon literacy. There's a new environmental calculation platform which is being developed by Agricultural Innovation Australia. This is a cross agriculture sector environmental platform, and the idea is that it will be designed to be integrated with Sustainable Wine Growing Australia, so that it will provide information both to you if you're a member of Sustainable Wine Growing Australia or not. You'll still be able to access this publicly available calculator. We know that energy costs are considerable and increasing. For most businesses, the third or fourth biggest cost. So we want to really focus on how we can use energy storage systems, renewable energy, and focus really on the financial benefits of this from an economic perspective to reduce emissions, but also to reduce costs. I think if I look at where you guys are in Margaret River, I think there's a great opportunity, particularly from a biodiversity hotspot perspective. As you know, Western Australia is one of the global biodiversity hotspots, and I think it's a great story that the wine sector, particularly in the southwest, could tell around biodiversity and contributing to biodiversity. And I think it's something that we'll see more and more of through reporting frameworks, that people wanting to understand that the product they're buying isn't having negative effects on nature or biodiversity, particularly from a land clearance or deforestation perspective. We also know that modern slavery is an increasingly concern of major buyers of Australian wine. So I'd like to build a knowledge base and build the skills of those within the sector to understand the risks associated with modern slavery and look at how we can reduce our exposure to that risk. So I talked about at the start of this presentation about a materiality assessment. This is an example of a really simple one from Systembolaget in Sweden. You can see that climate impact from an environmental and social materiality perspective and a financial materiality perspective is the #1 topic for them in Sweden. They're also interested in soil health and biodiversity, human rights and working conditions, and negative consequences of alcohol consumption. We can do the same thing if we have a look at Tesco's in the UK or Sainsbury's. I'm not sure if you can see this, but basically you're seeing that in each of these, carbon and climate is one of the key issues for these organisations. So we can expect that if you want to sell into these markets, that they're going to want information related to what we are doing within our own business operations to reduce the impact on climate. From an Australian focus, the Endeavour, so the Dan Murphy's BWS materiality assessment is on the right-hand side. For them, given the assets that they hold within pubs and pokies, a lot of the focus is around the risks associated with pubs and pokies. But their #1 planetary risk is greenhouse gas emissions. And we know, I've talked a little bit about Coles before being committed to science-based targets. That requires 75% of their suppliers, their largest suppliers by spend, to commit to reducing greenhouse gas emissions to help them achieve their goals. They also have a net zero target and 100% renewable electricity target. Metcash is probably a little bit smaller, but still relevant. And they're also aligned to science-based targets, and they have some solar targets as well. So all these organisations, they're concerned about climate change, which is why we are focused on it too. So I might leave it there for now and open it up to questions.
Anyone got any questions for Julian? I've got one quick question, Julian.
Yeah.
Given transport is a big focus of the emissions reduction roadmap. Is there any
Yep.
guidelines? Is there anything we can do to work with the transport sector? Are you guys working with the transport sector? How can we put a bit of pressure on, because we rely so heavily on it over here, how can we
Yeah.
put the pressure on to see them start going down the electric route or something that might reduce carbon emissions other than reducing our bottle weights, which will in turn reduce those emissions?
Yeah. Yeah, so I think there's a packaging efficiency discussion there as well about, if you look at the shape of a wine bottle, it's a pretty inefficient shape for transport purposes. So any way that we can increase packaging efficiency, but also lightweight. The transport sector, so yes, we are working with the logistics companies to understand what they're doing. And what we're hearing is that they're basically waiting for the technology to reach a price point which is makes it viable for them. And the time frame for that, the suggested time frame is 2027, 2028, when it looks like the technology will reach a stage which makes it a bit more affordable for large logistics companies within Australia. The marine side of things is really challenging. The marine sector is particularly hard to decarbonise. But there are trials going on. Maersk has looked at things like using biofuels. But of course, then when we look at refueling and the availability globally of biofuels, there are challenges there because there's just not enough for everyone to go around. And there are some perverse outcomes where we could look to increase biofuel production, but it may be a result of that is further deforestation in rainforest areas in favour of growing products which are easily harvested for biofuels. So it's a challenge. It is a challenge for us.
Can I ask, in line with that transport, do you have any figures on Australia Post? Where they're in terms of ESG, because you mentioned
On Australia, no. So I didn't really hear that, but was the question around Australia Post and what they're doing?
Yeah, their plans. I guess we've got a lot of small producers here and not necessarily trucking pallets, but sending parcels is a big part of us here. So
yeah, so Australia Post have gone down the route of offering carbon neutral, and you may have seen they have a carbon calculator that you can use on their website when you type in where you'd like your package to go, and you can elect to pay a premium to offset. So they've very much looked at rather than decarbonising their own operations, very much looked at the offset space. So paying some money to plant some trees somewhere or buy offsets through a market. I think it's a bit of a, we don't control what these organisations do, but I think it's always good to ask the question. And if it's recognised that there's a demand for them to do more, I think that's one way that we can advocate.
Yeah, my question was around the batteries with electrification. Just wondered what the actual storage on that relates to.
Did you get that, Julian?
No, so I only caught every second word, I think.
I think the long and short of it is battery, like I guess diesel versus batteries, in terms of batteries have their downsides in terms of all the mining to get the products that go into them, and how does that go versus using diesel in a carbon emissions framework?
Yeah, so purely from a climate perspective, if you look at a battery brand new, say you go out to buy a new battery compared to, I don't know, the diesel equivalent of, it might be a pump, say, for example. at the point of purchase, if you purchase them new, there's more embodied carbon emissions that sit within the battery system. But that changes very quickly depending on how much fuel you're putting through the other system. So if I think of it from an electric vehicle versus a traditional petrol vehicle, normally you have to drive a vehicle for somewhere between 13,500 to 18,500 kilometres to make up for the embodied emissions which are in the electric vehicle. So once you've driven an electric vehicle, say more than 18,500 kilometres, what the data shows is that you are winning from a climate perspective if you had to buy. I haven't explained that very well, but basically what it shows is that once you reach beyond a certain point, that the benefits of using an electric system outweigh that of the petrol or diesel equivalent. And for electric vehicles, that point, it depends on the vehicle a little bit because vehicles are different sizes, different and different efficiencies. But for most vehicles, it's somewhere between 13,500 and 18,500 kilometres. Once you've driven beyond that, you're better off driving the electric vehicle purely from a carbon perspective.
All right, I think we need to move on, but thank you so much, Julian. That was great. You're welcome to stick around and see what the next speakers have to say. We really appreciate your time today. It was super interesting.
Thanks so much. Thanks so much for having me.
Thank you. Now, Paul, are you there? Sorry, I know we've really cut you short now, but we have you. Can we hear you?
Yes, I'm here, Kate.
great.
I'm here.
Brilliant.
Can you hear me? Yes.
Yes, thank you. So everyone, this is Paul from Wine Tasmania. So he's going to talk about the RC protocol. We're a bit back to front because he's got to run today. But this is a carbon emissions accounting platform that they have implemented in Tasmania. So he's going to briefly talk about their experience. And then we've got Ben who will talk about the program itself. Thanks, Paul.
Thank you, Kate. Can you see my screen?
Yes.
Can you see my screen if I do presentation mode? Let's see if it works for us.
Yes.
And does it move?
It does. Brilliant.
Look at that, all the way from Tasmania. Hello, thank you. Thank you for inviting me, Kate, and hello, Margaret River. I've been invited to talk about our VinZero Carbon Action Program that we've started this year, which is sort of a direct impact to try and get to help wine businesses reduce their carbon emissions and also make an easy way to measure them. So first of all, I'm Paul Smart. I'm the Viticulture and Winemaking Officer at Wine Tasmania. We're a bit like the Margaret River Wine Growers Association over there, except we look after both the state and a region. So first of all, why? We grow grapes, we make wine, that makes CO2, it warms the climate, and temperature determines wine quality and style, which impacts how we grow grapes and make wine. That's the reason why we're doing this. And we'll take the science as given. So what have we done as a wine sector? So we have a VinZero sustainability program that we've been running here for 8 or 9 years now. It came out of the old McLaren Vale system, which was the precursor to Sustainable Wine Growing Australia. We still continue that here in Tasmania. And back in 2020, we realised that carbon emissions were really important. We added a new module to the VinZero sustainability program around carbon emissions. It was more around, putting actions in place and measurement. There's been a lot of interest since that we did that. And so we found some funding from the Tasmanian government. We put together a options paper and we asked the question, could we actually be carbon neutral in Tasmania? What would it take? And the answer was yes. So we put together an implementation for reducing our carbon emissions in Tasmania. That was through opinion advisory. We then kept doing lots of little things. In 2022, we understood that calculating carbon was really hard, that there's some research papers out there around, most of our emissions come from a very number of small sources, such as Julian said, fuel, electricity. So we put together a simplified Tassie wine carbon calculator, which would estimate 80 to 90% of your emissions. So you could see where you could make improvements. And then last year we applied for a new set of funding, which has led to this project, which I'm talking about today. And what we found through doing all of that, anything to do with carbon emissions, whether it's how to reduce your emissions, the programs, the certification schemes, the reporting, the measurements, everything. What we found was it's complex, it's expensive, it's hard to do, it's not really collective. We're not getting together as a group and doing it together, and it's really been unachievable. I mean, we've had carbon neutral programs in Australia for a very long time, and I still think there's only 3 wineries that are certified carbon neutral with the Australian Government Climate Active. So it's not that it's a new thing, it's just that it's really hard to do. So we needed to help our members. We've got a lot of small members in Tasmania, and they're small businesses. They usually do a little bit of everything, and so they're not experts in one thing. So we needed to really help them, and that's where the ERC protocol. Now we're back to front. Ben Daly would usually be talking about the ERC protocol first, but I've got to run off after this. So we came across this program, this ERC protocol, and what we found was that it was a really easy system. It was cheap, which is great for small businesses, it was user-friendly, and it was communicable. So our members could participate in this program, they could share it in their cellar door, they could share their plans, they could share their measurements, and also it was collaborative. You could actually see what other members are doing within the system. So, and one of the big things about this, and Ben has been great at ERC, is that it's evolvable, the program itself. It's very easy to change this program. And with the Wine Australia emissions reduction roadmap, what we've actually done is we've taken the emissions reduction guide that Julian was just talking about, and we've uploaded all those activities from the Wine Australia consultative report into the back end of this project, into the back end of the ERC protocol. So now when you log into the program, Ben will run this through with you. One of the modules is actually wine industry. So you can go into this module, you can see what activities are there to reduce your emissions, which are straight out of the roadmap. And we think it's a great enabler of this Wine Australia document that at the moment is just sitting on the shelf. So great, an easy program. So VinZero, what is that? I should talk about, I keep mentioning this word. So VinZero is our sustainability program. It's our umbrella for all sustainability in Tasmania. And now we've put into that our VinZero Carbon Action Program. And through the state government funding, we've been able to include access to the VinZero Carbon Action Program and the ERC protocol for every member in Wine Tasmania. So we didn't want to just launch an app. Sometimes when you do these things, you launch an app and nothing happens. So what we've done is we've got a 2-year program, and it's not only just access to the ERC protocol for all our members. We're actually doing a series of workshops and webinars, one-on-one visits, and the ability to report on our Tassie wine carbon emissions as a group, which is fantastic. And this is all supported through the Tasmanian government through a fund we were successful with. So that's what we wanted to do. And we launched this in February this year. And as you know, launching anything in February for the wine sector doesn't get much take up. So what I want to do now is run through results. And part of the great thing about the ERC protocol is this group reporting. So this is a snapshot of all the members who have taken it up. Most of this has been in the last couple of months post-vintage. So we now have 17% of our members who have started the steps of decarbonisation and reporting on carbon emissions. And you can see the list of people who are undertaking it and how far they have progressed through the system. And this is the reporting. Now, we have our annual VinZero sustainability report, which is coming out in a few weeks' time. What we're going to do is we're going to be adding to that now. We're not going to just be reporting on the sustainability workbook that we run, but also the carbon emissions that through the ERC protocol. And this gives a really good snapshot of how many members have taken it up, where they're up to in the system, what activities they're undertaking. And so it's a really good snapshot, and it's live. It doesn't need to be done once a year. It happens all throughout the year. So I can take a snapshot of this anytime I like. Also, the benefit for our members. So I've got here, one of our members has given us permission to share their report. This is basically their publicly available report. There's a QR code that you're given through ERC. It enables you to print that out, to put it in social media, to put it in your cellar door. And this is what would happen if you clicked on that. So Quiet Mutiny is a small winery only member. They crush about 8 tons a year. They buy all their fruit. And so they're very small. They do everything themselves, and this is their footprint. So I can't say it enough. The way to calculate carbon emissions through the ERC protocol is dead easy. It may not be perfect, but it's good enough. So this takes in your fuel use, your electricity use, it takes in freight, it takes in packaging. So it's really, I don't know of an easier way to do it. And if you're not doing this, I don't know what, you've got to be doing something. So as Julian said, mandatory reporting is coming, and you should be doing something. And there's never been an easier one. So drilling down into the Quiet Mutiny report. So the first step is they've committed, they've calculated their carbon emissions footprint. And the second step is actually the one that we're really excited about. And this is about actually doing activities to reduce emissions, because it's not just about reporting and offsetting. Reducing is the aim of the game. And so they've only got 3 activities there. And yeah, you've got a whole list of activities in stage 2. There's common things like changing light bulbs. There's things such as hybrid vehicles, but then there's also the stuff from the Wine Australia emissions roadmap, such as using sheep in the vineyard, or flotation instead of cold settling. Cold settling kills a huge amount of electricity, and flotation does not, and reduces your electricity use. So the third step there for Quiet Mutiny is the avoid. Now, Tasmania has the most carbon least intensive wine in Australia. That's thanks to our hydro scheme. So most of our electricity is hydro powered, about 98%. There's about 2% that is coal fired, which comes back across Bass Strait. So because of that, our emissions intensity in Tasmania is extremely low. South Australia is the next best with all their renewable electricity. And so we're kind of lucky. Our state-based retailer is one of the leading renewable energy retailers in Australia. So we get a tick for that. 100% transition to renewable energy just by buying the electricity from the grid. We've also run a workshop. So this is where we have members who had signed up to the ERC protocol. They brought their laptops for the day. We actually help them to fill out their emissions reduction plans so that they're able to communicate them to their members. And case study. Now, this is a draft. I can't share this. Kate, don't share this. What we're able to do as well is we're able to take some of those members who have completed their action plans and create case studies. So that way, sharing with our industry members, you know, this is one person, this is what they've done, these are the activities they're undertaken, and this is how they found about the scheme. So that's due to be shared very soon. And we will also share details of the Carbon Action Program at our upcoming field day. And I think that is me. I ran through that probably way too quickly, Kate, and I hope everyone got that.
No, that was great, Paul. Does anyone have any quick questions for Paul while we've got him before we actually delve into the ERC protocol?
Well, Paul, it's Ellie Jarvis here. I just wanted to ask, I mean, a lot of what you've shown us with ERC is really similar to Sustainable Wine Growing Australia. So what was the barrier to using that and going down the ERC protocol pathway? Was it that it was cheaper or?
Yeah, so we've had a lot of feedback from our members that Sustainable Wine Growing Australia is too hard for them. And so our sort of policy at Wine Tasmania is we don't care what sustainability program you do, as long as you do one. If Sustainable Wine Growing Australia isn't for you because it's really at a high level and you're just a small vineyard, you might be just selling fruit, you might be having a small vineyard that doesn't actually sell to any large retailers and you have your own cellar door, then maybe Sustainable Wine Growing Australia isn't for you. And then you're happy to do VinZero, which is basically the old McLaren Vale system. I don't know if we all remember from years ago. And that's VinZero isn't about reaching a certain bar. It's about measuring and understanding where you are and improving your practices. And it's more about those sustainability practices on ground rather than actually getting certified and getting audited, because there's none of that in VinZero. So that's probably why. It doesn't mean VinZero will run forever. It will always be responding to our members on what we do. And it may be, I'd be happy if everyone undertook VinZero, got to a certain level, graduated and did SWA. That's fine. They could do that. They can actually be in SWA and in VinZero at the same time. It just means that you don't have to do the VinZero annual workbook because we consider that at a higher level. Same for organic certified, biodynamic certified, ISO 14001, any other certification scheme that is around sustainability. We'll take that as done for the VinZero workbook. So that's why we have the VinZero sustainability system. Why we're running ERC, again, it's about being easy and easy to do. We've looked at the other calculators that are out there, such as the MRWA carbon emissions calculator, which I believe is the back end of Sustainable Wine Growing in Australia. And they're really, really hard and they're really complex. And they're perfect. They're perfect. They calculate out exactly what you need, and we're just looking for good enough. And sometimes perfect can get in the road of action, and sometimes we need imperfect to get some action happening. And we wanted action.
Thank you.
Jessica, did you have a question?
No.
Nope.
That's answered that.
Amanda, did you? No, I thought you had your hand up. Hi, Paul. This is Amanda, our CEO of the Wine Association.
Paul, I was just wondering how you were going selling in the ERC protocol as far as workload where people were already doing VinZero. Is it seen as kind of, I guess, more, or kind of do they feel like they complement each other well?
Complement each other really well. So what we've done now is, so those stages of the ERC protocol, stage 1, 2, and 3, 4, and 5, they align to one of the questions within VinZero, and it's around the measuring in the carbon emissions module. So that particular question was around measurement and actions to undertake. So what we've done is we've made a little easy, ready guide. If you're doing the ERC, you're at this stage, that's your answer for VinZero. So it made it quite easy. In VinZero, there was not a requirement to put in any data, such as fuel use or anything like that. It was more around, for the carbon emissions, are you measuring them? So now we've actually provided for them an easy way to measure.
Dan, did you?
Yeah, Paul, I was just wondering, anecdotally from your members, are you getting customer engagement through the ERC program with that storytelling aspect, their ability to use QR codes to see what the individual wineries are doing? Is that actual customer engagement?
It's way too early for us to answer that question. Can you come back in a year? I'll tell you, because we've only just launched it really. So our members, I haven't actually seen someone share a QR code yet on social media. So it's that new that they've only just done it and they've only just got their QR code. So that customer engagement, as a representative body, a membership organisation, it's also up to us a little bit to share that with customers out there and to help our members to also share it with customers out there. So we'll be working on that. Our focus for the next 12 months is getting people into stage 1, getting people to sign up, and then getting them to complete those action plans. And that's our real big focus for the next 12 months.
All right, anyone else? Brilliant. Okay, Paul, I'll let you run. Thank you so much for your time today. That was super informative, and it's so great to work with you guys down in Tassie and see what you're doing, and yeah, very exciting. Thank you very much.
No worries, and I'll leave my email address with Kate if anyone wants to follow up directly.
Brilliant, thank you.
Thank you.
See ya. All right, let's see if we've Larry's there. Have we got Ben?
Yeah.
Oh, look at you go. Don't even have to do anything. Brilliant. Okay, so this is Ben from ERC Protocol. He'll be actually sort of be able to tell us all about it from the beginning. So thank you so much for joining us, Ben.
Yeah, thanks for having us, Kate and Amanda, and great to meet. I've spent a fair bit of time in the Margaret River Wine area. I love the area, love the vineyards. And so thanks for being along today. And again, we can have this as interactive as you like, and I'm going to do just a brief background as well. I know a bit of this has been covered, and then we'll jump in and show you a bit of how this works. A bit about myself. So I've got a background in operations and aquaculture supply chain, and part of the reason I got involved in emissions is as a business manager, I was confused by it, and the more I spoke around, this is such an international, national, local issue that most people I spoke to were also confused by it. So I thought, well, if I'm confused and other people are confused, why is this so? So I actually spent 6 months of my life just researching carbon until I did, what is this problem that we're trying to fix, and what are the different roles in the economy to fix it? And as part of where this program came up, and really what was spitting out is there's a growing need for mass participation in programs and orchestration of information. And the programs available in the market just weren't conducive to mass participation and orchestration. So we sort of built a tool to help with that. So what we do, we do 3 key things. One is we help businesses get involved in climate programs. We'll talk a bit about today. The second part is we're helping corporates engage large supply chains. There was a slide before that Julian showed about Coles, Woolies. New mandatory reporting legislation is going to involve the need for large engagements with supply chains throughout the economy. So our tools are assisting with that. But we also engage the industries to empower their members to start decarbonising, because we're seeing that a lot of associations now have got demands in their industry to decarbonise, but they don't necessarily have the partnerships in place to support their members. So we're doing that. We're ISO certified and carbon audits, so we've got a fair bit of skill in the back end to deliver these programs. We're already partnering with the tourism industry, the caravan industry, the National Retail Association, Chambers of Commerce. You met Paul from Wine Tas. Our program is the national standard for the tourism industry sector now, and if part of the businesses here are part of, the WA Tourism Industry Council, our program is already part of the Quality Tourism Framework, which you can access it. They've white labelled it and called it Tourism Emission Reduction Commitment, but it's on the same platform. We partner with industries, as I said, because the industry is looking for trusted advisors and industry-specific accreditations. And I heard one question about some of the industry sustainability standards, and why is there a separate emissions component now? What we're seeing is a lot of the industry sustainability accreditations haven't kept pace with emission measurement, and emission measurement is quite tricky. And so they're now looking for emission measurement specific solutions, because that is now one of the #1 focuses in the marketplace, not necessarily just sustainability, but emissions. So we're coming in there and complementing quite a few standards with an emission measurement component, but ultimately it's the aim to become part of those accreditation and sustainability standards. We work with mum and dad businesses all out to mega corporates in the Australian marketplace. So we've got 5 tiers of service level. In WA specifically, we're working quite closely there with the tourism sector. With Evan and the crew, we've had quite a few conferences over there. And we're also doing quite a bit of work now with the caravan industry in WA. We work right across the economy. And I think part of the reason we're getting good traction is we're not, analyst carbon accountants. We've run supply chains, we've run large scale project management, we've run operations. We bring a lot of that expertise into our discussions with the business community. I know this has been covered off, but we've spoken to hundreds of businesses with carbon, and the reasons why to do anything in carbon, it's sort of quite compelling. Even though this is, it's a big environmental issue, business owners and business managers, it is still a business decision for them. And what's driving them to do anything tends to still come down to compliance. And these new laws are going to really force that hand. And we're seeing a change in behaviour already with the laws now being passed for 1 January, because a bigger customer wants them now engaged. You mentioned that you're in supply chains with Coles, Woolies, etc. The tendering and grant environment now, we're getting a lot of businesses coming to us now because they need an emissions program to win tenders and grants. So there's some of the core drivers that we're seeing. And then we see secondary drivers around employees, saving money, and consumers. And at the end of the day, what we tend to find is that getting involved in emissions now is just about running a better business. The climate outcome is a positive benefit, but it's not necessarily the core driver. And I think having an emissions program in place moving forward will be no different to having workers' comp insurance premiums or superannuation or other things that you need in place just to be a good business. Why haven't a lot of businesses bothered doing anything yet, even though this has been such a focal issue through the media? And I think Paul's covered on it. I saw Julian cover some of these things because it's been complex. And I think this market's almost been made up to be complex to service the consulting industry. And we really need to move away from exclusive accreditations now to very high inclusive ones, because we need very high participation. So complexity, cost, time, special knowledge, communication, and outdated tools have been a lot of the reasons that we're hearing why businesses aren't participating already. They don't have a solution that fits their need, and they can't therefore work out what's in it for them. What's my payback given those barriers? So we sort of went out to fix those. And we developed a methodology, and I'm going to show you this in sort of live practice, but we've got 4 levels in our program, and Paul mentioned progress over perfection. A lot of businesses that come in are looking just to start, and because they're not necessarily subject to legislation or compliance yet. And so they start with an easier start, but they can move up the curve when they want to into verified and compliance and audit level services as and when they're needed. So there's just a brief background. I'm actually going to jump in to show you the program now. And the methodology that we've established around this program is we looked at carbon neutral net zero standards. And we said, well, what are they trying to do? Carbon neutral was about offsetting, net zero was about reducing your emissions. The principles of what they were trying to do was good, but their participation rates were extremely low. So we said, well, how do we take those principles and make them much more accessible? Like in the case of the government's carbon neutral program, I mean, that's been around for 13 years. It's only got 500 businesses participating in it. So I said, we need 500,000 businesses participating in programs. So how do we take the complexity of that program, but apply its principles about what it's trying to achieve? So at the end of the day, within all the government policy and those standards, they're asking you to do 3 core things in the main. The first is calculate your emissions. The second is to generate actions to reduce them. And the third is to adopt renewable energy. So they are the foundation of net zero standards, and then carbon neutral then just adds an element of buying offsets off the back of that for things you can't avoid. So we took those and embedded them into a platform and systemised it. So in terms of calculating your emissions on here, firstly, if somebody else is already measuring your emissions, you can just input them in. We've got quite a few businesses using our program that another carbon accountant's measured their emissions. That's fine because they want to use our action modules. But we've got a calculator. And then we've got upgrade services, but I'll quickly show you the calculator in here. The calculator again's got all the sort of common areas that most businesses will generate emissions. So fuels, power use, employee commuting, business travel, logistics, waste, etc. All requiring some sort of business input data. But it would tend for SMEs particularly, it'll cover off 80 to 90% of their footprint within these categories. When you populate that data, on the back end, we've got all the latest emission factors and calculations from the government and various systems that'll always give you the latest set of information. It'll then calculate your footprint, and at our entry level program, you get a basic footprint report, which will break down your emissions by category and scope, and it'll also give you trend over time as you start recalculating future years. In our more upgraded services, we go into a lot more detail on the footprint report. As an example, this is a footprint report on the next level up, and it'll go right through your boundaries. It'll go through your footprint and a lot more information, etc. I'm not going to go through this in detail, but our base level one-page footprint report suits most of the businesses we're dealing with in the SME sector, but those needing tendering and compliance tend to go up to this next level to get a little bit more detail they need to meet those markets. Once you've generated your footprint, your next action is to lodge. Your next stage is to lodge actions, and in our action module, we've got quick wins. We've got stuff around vehicles, waste, power, capital goods. But Paul also mentioned the wine industry. We've actually got tourism and wine industry specific categories on the platform. So in the wine industry, we've taken every action that was sitting in the the Australian emission reduction roadmap from Wine Australia, and we work with Wine Tasmania on bringing this in. So we've just made it very quick to get to. So reducing tractor passes or slashing. Paul mentioned about switching over to cold stabilisation. There's a quick little info grab on what these initiatives are. You obviously look at the Wine Australia report too if you want to open it up. But it's quite simple then to come in and go, what areas can I focus on in reducing my emissions? If you're creating an action, a lot of businesses are coming on just to report stuff they've already done. So you can note actions you've done, stuff that you're planning to do in the future, or stuff that's underway now, and right out into the future. And particularly for capital projects, we've got businesses saying we're looking to transition vehicles over the next 5 years or 10 years. That's great. No different to what the corporates are doing. Particularly in this space though, tourism, wine, a lot of businesses are already doing a whole bunch of great things, and they spend most of the time just recording them down so they can communicate them back out in their reporting. After you've generated your action plan, and I'll show you how that comes up in your report in a minute, the third stage is to lodge a plan to adopt renewables. And again, this is quite a complicated space in Australia, but we've made it quite simple to understand if you've got, by location, any installed renewable equipment, if you're purchasing any particular renewable energy product or service, and if you're not sure what they are, they give you information about what they are, such as green power, carbon neutral power, or power purchase agreements. Or if you're using one of Australia's leading renewable energy retailers, which comes from the Green Electricity Guide. If you're not involved in any renewable energy for a particular location, or only partly, it then will ask you to set up a time frame when you're planning to transition to that site to renewable energy, note to how the corporates are committing to the future. The science-based targets encourage people to adopt renewables by 2030. But again, under net zero standards, you've got anywhere up to 2050. And then you're looking to indicate your methodology of how you're planning to get there. For most, we've got mum and dad businesses using this platform. They can generate their emission footprint, action plans, and renewable energy plan within 1 to 2 hours. You then get your dashboard, which Paul showed before. Dashboard is something that will link through from your QR code, which I'll show you in the platform in a minute. but it gives you some basics on your footprint. It will show what actions you've adopted by scope. And you can drill into more detail, actions underway, completed, not completed. It'll show what sustainability development goals that your action plan is linked towards as well. And then you can access your detailed report as well, which will list out your actions and your renewable energy transition. If you're so inclined, and we've got a few businesses involved with this in the program, you can also offset your emissions on the platform. So we've got a whole offsetting module, which links back to your scope 1 and 2 emissions. You can then select which projects in Australia you want to support. And then offset those projects, then you get your certificate, and that goes as a direct deduction to your emission footprint on your reporting. So you can offset your emissions in about 2 minutes on our platform. It's quite an easy process to do. Then Paul mentioned grouping and sharing. So firstly, from a share, every member on the platform gets their own link, unique link, which will take users straight to their emission reduction plans. Somebody asked about people using QR codes and the links. In the tourism sector, that's getting used heavily. So a lot of tourism operators are putting their link in to their emission reduction plan or their specific QR code on their websites or on their brochures or other things to get engagement with their audience on their plans. That's really easy to do. You just download them off the platform or copy and paste them in. You can also look up other members on the platform to see what they're up to. And that's been a really positive element of this program. What we're finding, particularly from SMEs, is that their problem's not hiding what they're doing. Their problem is communicating, and understanding what others are doing helps them to educate and learn about what other actions they can take. So if I look up tourism as an example, here's a list of some of the tourism and businesses involved in the program. Those that are on the view have completed the first 3 stages, and that's at what point that your plan becomes shareable. So you can jump in and see any of these businesses and look at their action plans to see what they're up to as a bit of sharing and learning. So there's a really brief overview. If your business is large and you're in the compliance arena, then we go all the way up to full ISO 1464 audits, which will meet mandatory reporting legislation. You get full board level reports, Power BI, drill through analytics. So what we tend to do when we're engaging with an industry sector is we come in and we've got 2 audiences we communicate to. One is the small businesses and how we get them underway with a basic program. The other is just the more medium and large businesses and how we help them into more the compliance arena. And they get special one-on-one attention with the carbon accounting team and the reporting to sort them out. So it really depends what business you are and what you're looking to achieve as to what sort of program that you want to take up. For most small businesses, our base program is sufficient in for now, which is using the calculator process. So I'll stop sharing there. There's a really sort of quick, brief overview. Happy to take any questions.
Anyone got any questions for Ben? Yes, hey.
Yeah, if you're a small producer, can you use this program to sort of click down through your emissions and understand how to optimize or what actions would give you the best results?
Yeah, great question. So that's actually an upgrade being released next week. So every action on the platform has got a high, medium, low impact rating and a dollar saving, and that gets matched to your scopes of emission and emission footprint. So you can then see what level of activity you're putting in from an action plan against your footprint. Now it's hard, it's hard to put an exact quantity on everybody's actions because some actions are, sort of generically described. But if you're converting over to an electric vehicle, that's a different level of impact than, say, to changing a light bulb, right? And we will indicate that on your action agenda to show you sort of what your level of focus is against your intensity.
Awesome.
Yep.
Anyone else? No? That's awesome. Thanks, Ben. Do you know anyone that is using ERC alongside SWA at this point, or?
So we've met with Sustainable Wild Growing Australia and Wine Australia, and also Austrade, because and we're just sort of, which I suppose navigating this environment the best we can, because the accreditation, the systems that are out there now, they serve some needs in this emission market, but the emission market's really advancing right now. So compliance level emission reporting, sharing data and orchestrating data are new needs that accreditation standards aren't sort of necessarily keeping up with. So we've really specialised in that area. In the case of tourism, we're complementing their sustainability standard and may at some point be part of it. So it's just an evolving space. I forgot to show on the platform, you can share your data with any supply chain or industry association with a click of a button, right? So we're seeing two needs out there now. One is people want to be able to measure their emissions, simply. The other is they want to be able to share it and aggregate data. And that task is almost as hard as the task of generating emissions. So we've made that quite simple now, and we've got businesses that are sharing their information between 3 associations and supply chains. We're also working with the federal government because we've got 3 government-funded programs already running through our platform. What we're hearing is the industry wants a nationally consistent approach. So we don't want 16 different standards that businesses need to abide by in emissions, particularly in the SME sector. So how do we start getting a commonality here for businesses to apply with? Now, someone mentioned about AIA, which is Agriculture Industry Australia, and they are developing a wine calculator tool. We're also working with aquaculture. They're also part of AIA. AIA has got a calculation tool which is making your wine calculation standards sort of come up a level, but it doesn't have action plan module. It doesn't have an action plan module. It doesn't have scope 3 emission reporting, and it's not integrated in with orchestrating data. But we can API that tool into our platform and be part of a nationally consistent approach as well. So we're sort of working across the economy now and some of the big chambers of commerce and the federal government to see if we can make this simpler for everybody and not have a poor SME being asked for 4 or 5 different accreditations to comply with this new legislation and the needs in the market.
Yeah.
I have another question.
Okay, Kate, back in.
Are you looking at adding biodiversity credits into your program?
Yeah, absolutely. So we've heard two sort of supplementary needs coming from the same groups. One is this immersion of biodiversity. So rather than just carbon credits, can we access biodiversity? And once there becomes like a more auditable framework around biodiversity credits, we'll be adding those in. The second part is there was a mention of modern day slave labour as well. And in the previous presentation, the same supply chains that want you to give them emissions data are also wanting your modern day slave labour compliance right now. And so the emissions tends to be the opening of the door into supply chains right now, but we're looking at tacking on the modern day slave labour as part of someone's profile as much as the emissions to also make that easier. Probably the third thing we've heard, particularly in wine businesses and farming businesses, is that they want a mechanism to understand the sequestration they're developing on their properties already. And, how do I demonstrate I'm already doing some good things outside of just reducing my direct emissions? And again, we've been working with AIA because they've developed a sequestration tool, which will give you an estimate. It's not under the formal methodology because most small businesses can't afford to adopt that methodology, but it'll give you a bit of a guide on what your sequestration could be on your property. And again, on our platform, we've got formalised offsetting, but we are also looking at going more of an informal estimate that someone can put in their reporting to say we're also got land and trees and regeneration that's could be assisting with our story, our emission reduction story as part of their report. So there's sort of 3 things we're hearing, in addition to just direct emission measurement.
Thank you.
Anyone else? Oh, one, yes.
What is modern day slave labour? Like, does that happen in Australia?
Yeah, so modern day slave labour is a legislative requirement that requires businesses over $100 million to report on effectively, do they have slave labour in their supply chains? You know, are they facilitating slave labour environments? And so there are requirements for those businesses to go out to their supply chains and ask, you know, do you have policies and processes in place to avoid using slave labour? And that's been around for a few more years than this new climate reporting legislation, but it's quite hard to get supply chain, you know, engagement on that arena. So like the banks, the insurance companies and stuff, they're looking for help in this space. So don't be surprised at some point if you're part of a large supply chain, they ask not only for your emissions information, but some information about slave labour compliance too with your operation. The question also came up about auditing. I saw it come up as a question, Mark. So again, the emissions world's a bit interesting because there's lots of different standards out there. The level of auditability over your emissions data depends on what your needs are in the marketplace. You know, so with our program, we've got all the way up to full audited accounts, but that's not required in most cases yet because the legislation doesn't require in all cases for Scope 3 reporting reasonable assurance yet. So Scope 3 reporting, which is your supply chains, which is where most wineries may get a tap on the shoulder from a large customer. First year mandatory reporting, it's optional. Then the second and third years, the auditability requirements in Scope 3 reporting are low. And on about the fourth year, the assurance level becomes reasonable. And so they're not necessarily going to be asking yet, do you have auditable accounts? But they will be asking you, do you have an emissions program in place so I can start to know that you're going to be helping us comply down the track when we need it. So the market, we tend to find that businesses need to start somewhere and be prepared to move up the curve on auditability over time. They don't need to start at auditability levels, you know, which sort of cost rules most businesses out from the start.
All right, is there any, oh, yes, Jessica?
My question may be a bit odd in terms of the context, but if all the reporting seems to be vineyard, winery, and then supply chain, but what happens, how do you put them together? Because if you've got some vineyard and you've got some winery, we do know those, then there's the rest, which we don't know. But how are we reporting, or how can we report for bulk? Where we put those together?
It's a great question. So like you've got your own, you know, accounting that you do for your business, carbon accounting is sort of similar, but it got a little few uniquenesses about them. So when you report on your emissions, you've got to report on the fuel you use and the power you use. Simplistically, that's called Scope 1 and 2 emissions. Scope 3 emissions, which is your supply chain, there's overlap in your measurement of the Scope 3 emissions and somebody else's becomes their Scope 1 and 2. So for example, if you're buying goods and services from somebody, or you're selling grapes, or someone else is buying your grapes, there can be overlap between what you're recording as emissions and what they're recording. And this is partly why the large corporates in particular who are asked now to report on Scope 3 are going to ask for some of your information to help with their reporting. They're going to ask you for some information to improve their understanding of the emissions that is sort of transferring from your business into theirs. So that's what we call mass orchestration of data through the economy to help with reporting. And it's really in its infancy. You know, it hasn't really fired off yet. Only a few businesses are starting to get into this arena. And in the meantime, without getting information from you, they're sort of estimating it from what they're buying from you in dollar spend, sort of dollar spend based emission factors. So, but back to your own business, your primary concern for your own business is firstly, what are you doing about your Scope 1 and 2 emission? So fuel use and power. And then you sort of move on to go, well, how am I addressing my Scope 3 emissions, which is like your packaging and your transport and logistics. So, you know, we tend to say, get your Scope 1 and 2 in order first, and then focus on Scope 3, and it'll be a lot more manageable for you as an organisation.
Yeah, well, that does answer some of it, but the other bit is that you have maybe a producer, a grape producer, and they may not make the wine, they may make the wine off-site through someone else. So how do you bring those back into the calculation
Did you get that, Ben?
to merge?
Sorry.
Yeah. So someone supplying grapes off and then bringing them back in.
Yeah, contract production. Third-party winery, essentially.
Yeah, well, I mean, effectively, if the goods and services you're paying for that third-party production will form part of your emissions footprint, right? The actual wine, the wine that's transferring in and out and that embodied carbon is a bit of a separate thing. So, and again, without going into the specifics of any particular scenario, complex supply chain interactions require a slightly higher level of analysis than simple ones, and we tend to find for most businesses starting out, just estimating, I've sort of what Paul made this point, just estimating some of their core activities that they're doing, such as, in the production of those grapes, their power use and their fuel use and transport. Starting there will give you 80 to 90% of what you need to know. The complexities then about transferring things backwards and forwards, which will be a sort of on the margin of your analysis, is something you can leave down the track, once you're underway, because that'll require you to sort of step up a little bit in what service levels you need to get that emission boundaries information correct.
Anyone else? No, all right. That's awesome. Thank you so much for your time, Ben. I love this program, and I see a lot of potential for it to work well with Sustainable Wine Growing Australia. And I think just the ease of being able to use your program to then create your sustainability action plan. And the joy of Sustainable Wine Growing Australia is that you can use your existing programs to answer their requirements and questions. So I think ERC protocol could actually work in quite well with that, and make that sustainability action plan an easy way.
Yeah, definitely. And I think at the end of the day, every business has their own little unique scenario. We have just a book a consultation and have a chat feature. It doesn't cost you anything. So businesses are going, what do I do? Where do I fit in? How should I be going about this? We line you up the 30-minute session with one of our carbon accountants, and they'll give you some direction. And they're really positive sessions. And people tend to come on really frustrated, swearing, expletives, and they leave going, oh, okay, I sort of get this now. I know what my next step can be. So just determine what your business need is. You do need a business need to get going on this, and then, go and find a bit of help about what your next step should be. And that's sort of the role we play with these partnerships with associations. So looking forward, if we can support Margaret River, that'd be fantastic.
Brilliant. Thank you. Thank you so much,
Great.
Ben.
Thanks, everybody. Cheers. Bye.
All right. Have I got Joe and Dan there?
Okay, yes, I'm here.
Hey, how's it going?
I'm doing well. How is everyone today?
Yeah, good, thanks. All right, so we've got Joe and Dan. So Ollie got pulled away to something else today, but Joe is a carbon and vineyard agronomist working with Quiteca over in McLaren Vale. And then we've got Dan from Airborne Logic, So Joe will be talking about, I guess, the carbon soil, insetting, offsetting, quantification. And then Joe looks at the greater, the greater farm property and carbon potential and measurement there. I think I've got that right.
Yeah, no, you've done pretty well. So thank you for that brief introduction. I'm hoping everyone can hear okay. Are you there? Can you hear?
Yes.
Yeah.
Perfect. Good. So, Kate, thank you for inviting me to come and speak to everyone today with MRWA. You're right. I'm based in McLaren Vale, and I've got a background as a viticulturist and as someone who works a lot in the soil carbon space. I actually run a business called Quiteca that does a lot of carbon estimation in soils and helps with advice around carbon projects for carbon sequestration. And we've got Dan French, as Kate mentioned, from Airborne Logic. He and I have worked together along with Andy Chambers in actually running some case studies in vineyards here in South Australia. So that's what I wanted to share with you today, is we actually received funding from the state government here in SA to go and measure the amount of carbon in a vineyard, in 5 vineyards actually, across different regions in South Australia, and then look at those numbers and kind of estimate what could be done about insetting. How much carbon could we sequester into the soil and on any environmental plantings on those properties as well, to help those wine businesses and those, whether they're growers or winery operations as well, to reduce their carbon emissions intensity. So what I'm going to do, I'm maybe just give Dan a quick chance to introduce himself while I get this screen shared so I can show you the presentation we've got here.
Hey, Joe. G'day, everyone. Hi, Kate. G'day to everyone in the room. Thank you for having us on board. Yeah, my name's Dan. I work with Airborne Logic. We are a remote sensing company, so we capture a lot of data for horticulture. We started in viticulture using drones and various cameras, and then use a lot of sort of backroom analytics to sort of crunch that down into really usable, actionable information, which started off being all about crop productivity and issues in vineyards. It's expanded out into tree crops. But a lot of the stuff we do these days is also concerned with natural resource management and carbon farming. And we've got a lot of experience now with working on carbon farming projects, and we really understand the place that remote sensing information has in all of this, and that's in accurately measuring and validating what's going on in a project or in a farming environment. And it's also providing the information for which you can model the potential of a project as well. So I'll get into all that after Joe introduces the talk and goes through everything about soil carbon. But yeah, thanks for having me on board. Are you ready, Joe?
Just about, yeah.
Right, so I need to keep talking, mate?
No, we're good. I'm just about to share here. So, okay, so hopefully everyone can see this beautiful little title slide here. So we looked at a basic carbon neutral vineyard as an opportunity for these 5 farms. So this was again a project that was partially funded by the state government of SA and Wine Australia as well, kicked in. We actually worked with Treasury Wine Estates because 2 of the vineyards that we baselined and measured on were Treasury owned. And we also worked with FarmLab. Ollie can't be here today, but FarmLab helped a lot around the quantification of soil carbon. So what I wanted to just start with is really talk a little bit about why carbon insetting. And I think Ben, who was on just speaking previously, did a really good job of talking about this and about the emissions calculation. A lot of businesses are starting to measure their emissions, and sustainable wine growing helps with that too. And once you have your emissions, there's talk about offsetting. So buying credits to really offset your own emissions production. Insetting is different. It basically seeks to sequester carbon from the atmosphere and retire it against your activity. So it's a different way to reduce your net emissions without having to buy carbon credits. Now, as a producer, a landowner and someone who works in agriculture, it's a pretty nice opportunity because you have land and you're involved in the production of biomass, which is essentially sequestering atmospheric carbon. So it's an opportunity that's available to people who are in the wine industry as well as other cropping industries. Why should we be talking about it? I think that's been covered pretty well today by some of the other speakers, but really the future is looking carbon neutral. So the targets of the wine industry, for example, wine industry with Wine Australia making a statement that they want to reduce emissions by 42% by 2030 and have a clear pathway to net zero by 2050. And so that's outlined a little bit by that emissions roadmap that Wine Australia's put out there. And that's covering the bigger industry as a whole. But then you've got individual organisations like Treasury Wine Estates, and there are many others who actually have net zero emission statements as well. And so net zero emissions are really talking mainly, in most instances, about scope 1 and 2, so their own contributions. Some of them are quite aggressive. So we're talking 2030 here for Treasury, and that's 5 years away. So needing to move pretty quickly. Some of the other things, we've got market drivers at play already, and certainly in other agricultural markets, there's a demand for emissions intensity value. And so that essentially means for every unit of product that your supply chain is buying from you, what is the embedded carbon in that? What's the emissions intensity? And that takes into account what your production of emissions are, less any carbon that you've inset or reduced through offsetting. And then that's a net value that they use when they're importing your product into their own system. So downstream users of wine grapes will look to start to reduce their scope 3 emissions in the future. I think Ben had really kind of highlighted that already. There's a lot of focus around scope 1 and 2, but it's pretty clear that scope 3 make up a large portion of their own carbon emissions. And when you've got B2B or business to business requirements around reporting of those, they're going to start to require that these scope 3 emissions are calculated. And as a great producer, that involves you. And lastly, why we're talking about the cost of offsetting versus insetting. And a lot of these decisions come down to cost impact and return on investment. What we're talking about here is the demand for carbon credits, which are available in the market for purchasing as offset, is likely to increase, because there is we believe, going to be scarcity around this market into the future, with so many corporate entities wanting to offset their own emissions. It may actually turn out that insetting is less expensive over the medium to long term for businesses who are able to sequester their own carbon in soil and tree plantings. I just wanted to explore a little bit here the perspective of a producer that we know very well. We worked with in this study, and it's called Hither and Yon. They're a South Australian-based wine business. They have their own vineyards and wine production, and they're the first South Australian winery to be certified carbon neutral by Climate Active. And so Climate Active is essentially the government entity that needs to sign off on your carbon neutral status if you want to be declared carbon neutral as a business. So to do that, they went and each year they go through an auditing process, a little bit like what ERC was talking about. They use a group called Pangolin here in South Australia. And through that auditing process, then they are looking to offset around 300 tonnes of CO2 per year. And they're buying these carbon offsets at around $20 a tonne in an international market. And they're doing that because already the carbon credits in Australia are a little bit more pricey. We've got a really good reputation around the validity of our carbon projects in Australia, and so they command a bit higher price. But they're also saying that what they're finding is they're finding it hard to buy those units at a reasonable price. And I think what Ben showed in his previous presentation was that, when you're looking to buy those, they're around $60 through that ERC site. So they do fluctuate a bit. What Richard Leask from Hither and Yon was talking about is he's really seeing that there's the need for this robust framework around being able to calculate, firstly, your emissions, but then measure your insetting activities in a business. What are you doing in the soil space regeneratively? What are you doing with tree plantings? The ability to measure that for all growers in all scenarios across the wine industry. So the carbon system right now, the carbon credit system or the market right now in Australia is really set up very much around is really set up around offsetting. So if you're a business that's measured your emissions, it's very well set up for you to go and buy credits, but it's not very well set up for you to go and retire credits or inset against your own operation. So that's perspective from Richard here, who is involved with it. I won't get bogged down too much in the nitty gritty here, because I know you've had a reasonably long group session, but this is some of the numbers that come out of the Hither and Yon operation. So we've got 3 charts here, chart A, B, and C. A and B are really looking at that audit that was completed by Pangolin, and they're looking at the amount of emissions that they're generating from each of these activities as a business and what that makes up as a percentage of their entire operation. And category, or chart C, I should say, is actually come out of the Sustainable Wine Growing Australia audit. So this is where you're measuring scope 1 and 2 emissions only. And the main important thing to pull out of this is that the vineyard scope 1 and 2 emissions are only about 7% of the total product embedded carbon for their wines. So what that says is, firstly, that there's not a lot of contribution in the scope 1 and 2 emissions coming from the production of wine grapes, but it also means then there's an opportunity to pretty much completely negate that through insetting. So a quick overview of the project that we ran here. We set out to achieve basically 5 key elements. We wanted to quantify the soil carbon stocks that were already on these vineyards. We wanted to estimate the potential carbon sequestration we could use in both soil and tree plantings on those sites. We prepared land management strategies, which are documents that you would need to generate if you're lodging a carbon project with Australia. And it talks about having that action plan about how you're going to change management practice on your property to sequester carbon. We helped to register the first soil carbon project in South Australia with Treasury Wine Estates. So this is the first vineyard that's lodged as a soil carbon sequestration project. And we looked at how we could explore emissions intensity reporting out to the wine grape market. I'm only going to really talk about the top 2 today, just in the interest of time, but this is a bit of an idea about what we're trying to run with this project that we ran over the last 6 months or so. So soil carbon estimation, what we did here is we went and we did what's called a baseline on these properties to measure the amount of organic carbon that's in the soils currently. And we did this in a way that is compliant with the Clean Energy Regulators legislation. So it's actually a standard that's legislated, and we call it the CER Methodology Determination 2021. These are reviewed from time to time. But importantly, in the 2021 methodology, there's room for you to actually do a baseline for permanent row crops, which there wasn't previously there, but it does open up the opportunity to do this for vineyards and orchards. So essentially what you're doing is estimating the amount of soil carbon you can have in the under vine or under tree area, and also the inter-row area or the headland area, because they're likely to be different. But you can actually audit them and measure them in separate entities. The reason why we did it in a way compliant with the methodology is because Climate Active, who actually sign off on you being a carbon neutral entity, they only currently accept soil carbon projects that are registered with the Clean Energy Regulator. So we're wanting to do this study in a way that is consistent with what you would need to do if you're going to seek carbon neutrality status from the regulator. Importantly, with each of these projects or these case studies, we had to look at what practice change might be applicable. So within a carbon estimation area on the vineyard, you need to have an eligible management activity. So what they're saying there is you need to go and have some kind of management change applied to that CEA or the carbon estimation area that has some kind of newness in your management strategy that is likely to build carbon in the soil. So on the table there, I've just kind of summarized, these are the 13 eligible management activities that you can do as a vineyard now that would satisfy the newness requirement. If you haven't been currently doing these things, you could adopt this practice, and that would be sufficient to say, yes, you're eligible for a carbon project in the soil space. They're likely to help you build carbon. So I'm happy to talk to you guys separately about these. If you've got questions about the eligible management activities, you can hit me up at the end of this. Importantly, we had to work out how we were going to model these carbon estimation areas. So these are areas of land that are managed differently but exist on the same title. And so in a permanent row crop, we developed this system where we actually went out and surveyed the entire row crop. And this is where airborne logic played a significant part, because we need a lot of accuracy with this. It was done using aerial survey techniques, and satellite imagery is not sufficient for this level of accuracy. But what we're doing is really mapping out the pink areas are the inter-row areas. They are one estimation area of the project, and the green areas were the undervine strip, which were managed differently to the inter-row, and so they form their own estimation area. The reason we went with this approach is we knew that it would be scalable and reproducible over different row crops and different vineyards. So row spacings changing wouldn't affect this. It's a pretty consistent way of applying a rule to how you map these things out. So once we had identified these different carbon estimation areas, we could then go out and start to sample the soil in these areas and come up with an estimation for the carbon units. Just wanted to throw out this slide here to kind of explain what it all means when you start looking in a vineyard setting. I'm sure most of you are pretty familiar with this setup. What we're really doing is identifying the management practices that are different between the undervine strip and the inter-row, because the newness requirement about how we're going to manage those zones, we need to have a system or a strategy in place about how we deal with that. So in the inter-row area, we might look at doing an introduction of legumes or pasture rejuvenation if you're in a system where you're not tilling. And in the undervine strip, you might look at doing some pH amelioration or gypsum addition to manage sedicity. Lots of different things. You might be applying organic compost or mulch in those spaces, which are likely to improve soil health. So there's a variety of different things you can do. And then within those different zones, you have your random sample points, which are the blue pins, and they are generated by a random number generator. So we do this, that's stipulated by the methodology. We do it so that there's no bias towards the good areas of a vineyard or a bad area of a vineyard. We're trying to make this completely random and auditable. So some pictures of how that works. We use push coring systems. So we drive down a barrel into the ground, down to 60 centimeters in this case, and we measured the soil carbon fraction in the top 0 to 30, and then in the 30 to 60 centimeter fraction. So we got a top soil carbon measurement and a subsoil, and we measured that in both the mid-row and the undervine area for both these projects. This is really where FarmLab was quite useful, because once you have your carbon estimation areas mapped accurately using the survey from Airborne Logic, FarmLab actually help you create those random sampling points, and then you take that into the field and can navigate to those very accurately. You can perform essentially all the measurements you need to do and take the chain of custody images, notes, photos that go along with this. And then once these samples are analysed and come back from the lab, FarmLab actually does this calculation that's required to estimate the amount of tonnes of carbon in your soil in a way that the Clean Energy Regulator accepts. So they're a verified tool that you can submit your results straight to the Clean Energy Regulator. I'll just take a little break here and hand over to Dan to talk a bit more about the tree carbon estimation side of things. So just to summarise what I've explained there is how we went about setting up the project for measuring the soil carbon that's in the system already. And then Dan's going to talk a little bit about how we're measuring the tree carbon and starting to calculate what we could get if we were to plant out in these spaces.
Awesome. Thank you, Joe. Presume everyone can see me, hear me, do what's necessary. That's good. So yeah, just before I kick off, I just wanted to say, just wanted to acknowledge all the partners in this project, which we all worked together really well, and it was exciting project. I mean, this was groundbreaking stuff, really evaluating, testing pathways for vineyards and practical methods for how you might work towards carbon neutrality. But I would think that a lot of this stuff also has co-benefits to great production, which is really cool as well. So and just talking about, I don't want to ram it down anyone's throat, but just to talk about the need for all this. We do work on a lot of, carbon projects now, and you've all been exposed to the ESG reporting requirements that are coming. And, you know, in the conversations that we're having, the pressures are coming from everywhere in the demand, and you know, it's coming from the supply chains, it's coming from the investors, from the banks. You know, there's a social license aspect, and there's obviously your own personal values. I know that most farmers are really tied to the land and the environment, and they're very committed to doing the right thing. And so this has all these things coming at it. And it was really interesting to hear someone in the room just mention biodiversity credits as well. It's not just carbon at all. This whole biodiversity piece is coming at us at 1,000,000 miles per hour. And the great thing about some of what we're talking about here is it has overlaps with all that biodiversity reporting and crediting side of things as well. And, you know, like in some of the conversations we're having, the market intelligence suggests that, you know, the real demand for carbon offsets for the actual credit units that polluting companies or big emitters want is probably going to happen around 2030 and beyond. So that's just like if you're seeing high prices and costs and things at the moment, I imagine, like, not crystal balling too much with any certainty, but that's probably just like a, you know, an early indication of where things are heading. It's going to get costly, I think, to offset stuff. And the more you can do on farm, the better. But you've also probably got an opportunity here, or some people have who've got land, is that, you know, when you set these things up, like the value or the cost of an ACCU, Joe was talking about it before, buying overseas credits is less expensive than Australian ones because the Australian carbon farming and crediting system has a lot of integrity. And that means the value on all this is high. And this is why we're really invested, I guess, and what we'll talk about here in accurate measurement of what's actually happening on your farm. Because, you know, like you can model things, and we'll talk about modeling, which is right here on this slide. And modeling's one thing, but you're going to have to, you know, if you enter into these things, you're going to have to actually think about measuring and validating what's happening in a project over time, because that's what people are demanding, and that's what the government is demanding, and that's what we obviously all want as well. We all want these projects to be doing something meaningful that shifts carbon out of the atmosphere, sequester in the soil and in trees, and hopefully, you know, works towards stabilising the climate a tad. So I'll jump into the talk now, and I'll go through it as quick as I can, because I know everyone gets a bit fatigued on these things after a while. But what we've got here is, I guess, we've got 4 slides here, which will show you the process that we ran through on these projects. And that started with modelling, and you know, then it requires measurement, and then some sort of verification of what's actually happening. So when you're considering a tree carbon project in particular, the vineyards that we're working with have been going out and they've been doing what's called biodiverse plantings, or environmental plantings. So they set aside a piece of land, and, you know, if you're considering this, like one of the Hither on Yon vineyards, they had retired a block, which was a couple of hectares from memory, and they are dedicating that to an environmental planting project. So when you're having a look at that, there's a couple of tools that you can use, which is Full Cam here, and there's another one which is easier to use and free through Cyro called Look-See. And that can basically take your location, which, you know, like takes into account soil types, rainfall, climate, and the types of project that you're going to do. And then it sort of predicts what the growth curve would be on that forest area, and hence how much carbon that project would sequester over its lifetime. And there's 2, I guess, options for project life cycles in terms of carbon projects, and that's 25 years and 100 years. So the trick, or one of the caveats with a shorter term project, is because that might sequester carbon for a short amount of time, there's some discounts often applied to the total carbon that's modelled for that project. If you're going to launch into like a larger landscape style project, they'll subtract 20% of what you're modelling here from your overall, registered carbon credits that you can claim, just because that's insurance against what happens after that 25 years. So here's a bit of an output from an example of what a modelling output looks like, and you can see that when you start off a project, there's a initiation period where, like, the trees obviously take time to establish, start to grow, and that's that growth curve you can see there on the right. And alongside of that, there's your sequestered carbon increases over time, and then it levels out. So all these calculations are taken into account when you would be planning a project. And you can see down this McLaren Vale project, because of its climate, soil type, etc., this one potentially has the ability to sequester, 13 odd tonnes of carbon per hectare per annum, which then you convert to the CO2. Oh, sorry, that is CO2 equivalent. So that's something that you can look at when you're considering a project and think, okay, well, how much impact is this going to make in regards to reducing my operations emissions? So yeah, can you flick the next slide, please? Thank you. So when we're going out and measuring or setting up a project, we use the drones with high definition cameras, which we used to segment the vineyard and the block for the soil carbon aspect. So getting your boundaries between your eligible and non-eligible zones is really important, because that obviously dictates how much carbon you can claim as a credit or an offset. But the same thing in trees, with tree measurement. We use a couple of techniques, and that's by flying overhead using high definition cameras and using a process called photogrammetry, which produces a three-dimensional model of that landscape, a bit like what you're seeing, but more accurate and a part of emerging methods to work out what's actually going on. And includes LiDAR, which is basically that little device on the right or something similar to it, which is firing out lasers and measuring the refraction and rebounds of those back on that device, and creating a three-dimensional model of a tree in this instance. And the interesting thing there is that that record is permanent. You keep that stuff on file. And the other thing is you can do a whole heap of detailed measurement on that tree or that plant. Same would work on a vine. You can basically strip away the leaves. You can dissect that tree into sections, and you can look at the information we've got here, which is basically working out tree height and the diameter breast height, which is all these methods or these measures are what's used or what has come out of commercial forestry to estimate the actual volume of, or measure the volume of what is in that tree that you're looking at. So there's a lot of fancy stuff that goes on behind the scenes there to work that out. And in all honesty, this is actually some emerging technology and analytics which is going on here. You can imagine in a forestry environment, a lot of the trees in Europe or pine plantations and that sort of thing are very uniform. They're very straight. They don't have much deviation in terms of the curve or in a trunk or anything like that. And then we get out into a native bush type environment, and everything has these kinks and twists and knots, etc., etc. And trying to actually reduce a point cloud, which is what this essentially is. That's what the output is called. The three-dimensional model of that tree is called a point cloud. So actually refining it to a point where you can be confident that you're measuring the branch and the trunk, etc., without adding a couple of centimeters to it, for example, over the whole the entirety of the tree is something that we're working on pretty hard, but we're getting really good results on now. And what you get out of the end of that is basically you get a measurement of what volume of wood is contained within that tree. And then if you can have some information on, there's some published information generally that you refer to on what the moisture content and hence the dry mass of the tree is, then you get a carbon calculation, which if you multiply that by 3.67, that works out to give you a figure for how much CO2 or carbon dioxide gas that tree has got contained within the system there. So this is just explaining the process to you on how we actually get to that end point of working out how much carbon has been sequestered and verifying and validating that. The interesting thing that I probably thought I should mention as well with all this precise measurement stuff is that at the moment, a lot of these schemes are set up to include trees, but some of the emerging methods, such as the integrated farm and land management method, which we expect will hit, pretty soon. They've been talking about, it was supposed to be introduced, or at least the draft legislation was supposed to be, and guidelines were supposed to be put forward at the end of last year, and things are dragging out probably to the end of this year, but they'll get there eventually. Will include, plants down to 1.3 metre height as well in these models. So when you're considering that, and then also the biodiversity aspect, capturing records and actually verifying what's going on your land, remote sensing is a valuable tool because it gives you the ability to capture permanent records and capture information and analyze information at scale, which is what we're really talking about here. And just while I'm talking about that biodiversity angle, there's two things that you could be considering, I think, from a grower's perspective in all this, and that is like setting up projects which you use for insetting and offsetting your own emissions, but also considering that perhaps the value of carbon credits is going to go up. Over time, some of these projects might create alternative revenue streams depending on the scale that you do them at. And, if you take into account the fact that demand for accus and supply, demand's going to increase and supply is going to get squeezed, we think, then, that's something to consider alongside all of this. And the thing that biodiversity has to do with that is that you can currently, or you're starting to be able to trade biodiversity units, which is basically looking at a hectare of your scrub, for example, and qualifying and quantifying the diversity of that and showing that it's improving over time. That's looking at plants, but also looking at the types of animals that are associated with all that. If you can actually capture, for example, threatened species presence on your property, then that's definitely worth something. That's something that people are willing to pay for. But biodiversity, is the position, the value of a credit for a hectare isn't huge at the moment. But what biodiversity is doing is significantly increasing the value of a carbon credit. So if you're thinking about at any point creating carbon projects, having diversity in them and setting up and thinking about measuring biodiversity alongside could double the price of your carbon credit, and it might do more than that into the future. This whole biodiversity crisis that we've got going on globally is something that corporates and governments and everyone's really starting to pay attention to and trying to, I guess, fund the recovery of. So that's something to consider as well. All right, Joe, do you want to just do the next slide if you can, mate? Okay, just back one if we can. Hang on, there's the last one. There's one in between, wasn't there? Oh, here we go. All right, so yeah, what we're seeing here is, well, what you can see here, I think, is that, you know, like the potential for offsetting emissions using trees is significant, that it varies between regions and sites. So having some understanding of that up front is important if you're thinking about initiating some of these projects. But the other thing to think about here is that with trees, you know, they do grow fairly quickly and they're quite permanent. So, you know, if we're talking about the 25-year period that we've got on a project. So for that reason, I think, you know, we've found through this project that trees and plants do have significant potential to help offset your carbon footprint. So yeah, it's something for you all to think about, and you know, that we're happy to help you sort of work out what the options are if we can. So I'll flick it back to you now, Joe, because I know you've got a couple of slides to finish off on.
Yeah, great. Thanks, Dan. I appreciate that. So the numbers, although I'm here in McLaren Vale and I'm showing you numbers for what you would suggest you can sequester environmental plantings each year. So let's say McLaren Vale around 13 tonnes of CO2 per hectare per year. When you look at Margaret River numbers, you're higher than us. So you're into the 20s over there. So, you know, that does start to talk about, if you're looking around 20 tonnes of CO2e per hectare per year, that can start to add up pretty significantly and look to offset your own emissions as a business. So one of the nice things around the tree carbon aspect is you get paid out on the modelling number, having to do the repeated measurement you do with soil. So generally looking at strategies of using both environmental plantings and measurements. What I just wanted to cover over here was looking at the results from the measurements we did across these 5 vineyards in the component. And these were the results we got back, looking at the amount of organic carbon in the soil right now as a snapshot of time that we would or T0. And then the way carbon in soil is you do this same measurement again in a time step. Usually generally it's 5 years, but some people go 3 years, and you measure the difference in the organic carbon at that point, and any increase essentially fantastic. You subtract any of your project emissions from that increase, and the remaining is carbon paid out for or has equity or can be used against your own emissions as a business to inset, reduce that value. So I'll talk about the first 4 columns in this chart. I won't get bogged down too much with the numbers, but the first 4 columns are talking about 0 to 30. The next 4 are talking about subsoil, so deeper carbon levels. Inside this red square is just to highlight that the difference between the interrow and the undervine soil carbon was more than not we had high organic carbon levels in the undervine area. And these were vineyards that were minimal input conventional vineyards. Some of them were essentially organic in practice, but not certified. And typically we were higher organic carbon in the top 30 centimetres in the under vine area. And we think that's due to, we've got a very Mediterranean climate here in South Australia. We've got very dry summers. And what the vines are experiencing and the soil below those vines is experiencing more moisture for more months of the year. So they've got rainfall when the mid-row has as well. We also get supplementary irrigation. And 2 of the biggest drivers around organic carbon production in the soil is soil moisture and soil texture. Now, in the circumstance where we had bigger carbon fractions in the mid-row, it's very, both of these vineyards we measured were essentially doing in the mid-row. So they were grazing cattle and sheep in the mid-row. And in the case of the Coonawarra site, this was one that had previously been pasture and been planted to vineyard in 5 years. So pretty consistent numbers there. The columns that talk about tonnes per hectare, this is where we actually say, look, we take the percentage of organic carbon, we multiply it by the bulk density, we get a total absolute number of, they're pretty consistently sitting around the 40 to 50 tonnes of carbon per hectare per plot. We're in the far on the right hand side. This is to give you an idea of, if we assumed that most areas of vineyard would be 1/3 of vine rows and 2/3 of inter rows, then for every hectare of vineyard, these are the numbers of carbon that you would have in there. So tonnes per hectare per vineyard of organic carbon, it varied in 40 to 90, and that's a function of the bulk density and the soil type. When you look at the amount of CO2e, obviously we're multiplying that out. So every tonne of carbon in the ground that we can measure is 3.67 tonnes of atmospheric carbon. So if you can build oil in the vineyard by 1 tonne, you're going to actually increase the amount of sequestered atmospheric carbon by 3.67. That's pretty much what we are doing here with this next. So we got the 5 vineyards that we measured. We looked at what we could generate if we set up a mental planting tree project on that site. So we use the numbers out of Fulcombe to say we sequester into tree and revegetation biodiversity plantings, and that's what you see in. So tree C sequestered per hectare, and this, for the purpose of this chart, what we said is we started a project today. What would we have in 5 years if we started a tree project and we adopted management changes to soil, which would allow us to build 200 kilos of organic carbon per hectare per year? That's pretty much the industry literature says is really achievable. If you have mils of rainfall, you can look to build around 200 kilos of carbon per hectare per year. And so that's what you see in the number 2, which is conveniently it works out to 100 kilos of carbon per year. It's 1 tonne of carbon over a 5-year period, which is 3.67 tonnes of CO2e. And then what we did is we added those 2 sequestered carbon amounts through the tree plantings and the soil building, and we compared that to what our SWA emissions values were. And we chose the Sustainable Wine Growing Australia because it's something as a benchmark for all the growers, because they're all currently reporting through that method. Easily see that plant only 0.05 hectares of your site to environmental plantings, 5% essentially of your area to environmental plantings, and changing practice on your ground, you easily end up in a carbon neutral position compared to what your emissions are at the vineyard level. Just wanted to highlight one thing in the column.
Joe, your mic's cutting out.
Better?
Still a bit crackly there, Joe.
Try to speak a bit clearer.
So can you just
Sorry. Yeah, sorry, Joe, we just got a question if you wouldn't mind.
Yeah, of course.
Can you just ask, looks to me like the soil sequestration covers the emissions, not even doing the tree plant. Is that correct?
Did you hear that one, Joe?
Yep. It definitely worked out that way for these sites. And especially if we look at the row for the Wollonga site, that had very low SWA emissions. And the reason is they're using contractors exclusively, and sites are using their own machinery. Because SWA is only taking into account emissions, they have a very low footprint. The overall intensity, which is the right-hand column, is showing that for every tonne of grapes that you're sending off of your site, they're actually sequestering carbon. If you, or carbon neutral, I should say, or carbon, if you had taken both of these actions. But you're right, absolutely. If you have a carbon project in your soil that could deliver 1 tonne of carbon per hectare over 5 years, you'd be in a position where, in these cases of these vineyards, you'd be carbon neutral.
So I'd be very interested in that because my figures are lower than the SWA emissions, and I'm counting everything. And vineyard, their ours much lower than that. So if I can put it against doing some soil amelioration, I'd be sweet.
You're laughing.
Totally agree. And look, I'll wrap it up because one more slide to share. But that perspective as well is that currently these things, well as the wine group, is when to measure our emissions, and like you said, you're trying to measure everything. It's fantastic that we can get to an emissions number, but until we can start to measure what we're doing in a positive sense and insetting, we're not going to really get a complete picture of what our position is as a business, as a great producer. And I think what this shows is that the ability carbon neutral is very much within grasp at the vineyard production level. Okay, that was really the purpose of doing these categories, was to say, look, how close would we be if we were a great producer to being carbon neutral, if we wanted to go that way? The answer is it's more than likely within reach at the vineyard level. If you're a vertically integrated business, you may be needing to look at doing both activities of tree planting to offset some of the other production emissions. But there are some drawbacks. So I'll kind of explain. In terms of carbon insetting, yes, at the vineyard production level, it seems to realise that pretty well in most moments. And I would hazard a guess that Margaret River.
Sorry,
Hey, Joe, your mic's shocking.
I'm going to try and speak directly to it. Is that better?
That's better.
Cool. Yeah, so I think in McLaren, a good indication of what's achievable in other regions.
It's not much better. It's a bit, it's cutting in and out a bit.
Oh gosh, this is so annoying. I'm going to try and
hardware failure.
Yes, I'm going to try and just get rid of my headphones and go straight to my what do we? I'll go to. That's better. It's still no good. No good.
Yeah, you're there speaking. Yeah.
Now good?
Yeah,
Okay,
no,
got you.
Brilliant. Thank you, Joe.
All right. Thank you for bearing with me. I know it's frustrating. So, yeah, basically at the vineyard level, we think that's within reach, but there are some drawbacks. So if you're looking at a soil carbon project, it needs to be registered with the Clean Energy Regulator if you're going to try and claim carbon neutral status. And that has some development cost. So there's no cost in registering a project with the government, but generally you need to work with someone who helps you develop the project, and that can have a price tag in the thousands of dollars. And that's really just to ensure that you're following the method, and they usually have a bit more experience in that space. The second part about it, which is a bit annoying, is you need to physically go and resample in the vineyard, and usually you have to wait 3 to 5 years before you can prove between measurement 1 and measurement 2 you've made a change. So you've got this waiting to claim, essentially. And in that 5 years, you can't really claim any position on it. The other thing is it relies on measuring a relatively small gain in organic carbon against any variability that may be within the space. So because the sampling locations are random, you may end up with different numbers between each sampling period, and we're needing to pick up that subtle change in the amount of carbon we're building. 200 kilos per hectare of carbon that we built out of a pool of 50 tonnes is a very small percentage. So we need accurate measuring. And then the last point there around needing to have a bit of a buffer in there is in regard to that discounting of the carbon credit units that Dan mentioned. And that was basically they discount what they're going to pay you. They take 20% off the top, basically, as they call it to guard against any risk of reversal, where your carbon in the soil may actually decrease over time. So there would be a discount. If you're eligible for, let's say, 100 carbon credit units, they would only issue you with a maximum of 80 at that first issuance.
And then in the winery production level, we're looking obviously at much bigger total pool of emissions, and so that's where environmental plantings probably will come into place, because they're going to generate carbon units more quickly and a larger volume over the duration of that project. The other thing I'll just mention here is that we found out in our particular region that the water allocation plans within our region were not consistent or congruent with being able to do carbon plantings or plantings for biodiversity. There is no limitation on doing biodiversity plantings, but if you're going to then want to claim carbon credit units from it, it was prohibited. And so this is where I feel like, and Ben talked about it, is the whole market is moving faster than a lot of the legislation is keeping up with. And so in our instance over here, we're needing for the water allocation plan to be amended to allow carbon or environmental plantings to take place as carbon insetting. So I'll give you a chance to ask questions. I'm sorry, I was a little bit long-winded towards the end, and thanks for being supporting of the microphone issues I was having.
Thank you very much, Joe. I've just got coming back in.
Thanks, Joe. Sorry, I just had to duck away for 2 seconds. Was there questions?
No, we're literally just getting to questions.
Yes, there's questions. Jessica has questions.
So I've got a couple of questions. Hopefully you can hear me.
Yep.
A lot of our soils here are really diverse within a very short rod. How variable have your soils been in terms of doing this calculation? Because that quite worries me, that trying to monitor it, we might get quite variable results quite quickly.
Yeah, absolutely. So for comparison to that, out of the 5 sites that we measured, we had probably only 2 that were pretty homogenous across the vineyard. The other 3 did vary within the space, and that was partly due to topography, but also geology, the history of it. McLaren Vale is got a very diverse mix of geology over a short distance. So the way you go and mitigate that is really around dividing up your carbon estimation areas. And I didn't explain this in great detail, but once you've got your estimation areas being your mid-row and undervine, they further get divided into what's called strata. And the strata is a fancy word for zones. And that's where you divide them into zones which might be similar. And this is a good example of where you would do that, where you expect the soil to change, or if you've got surveys such as EM38 data, you can use that to divide them into zones, with the idea being that when the numbers come back from the testing, you're reporting on the amount of carbon in each zone or strata within that CEA. And the higher the confidence, or the narrower band of those results, the higher credibility is given to your carbon credits. So yeah, that's how it's tackled in a project sense. But yeah, great question, because this is something that a lot of growers are faced with.
And then the other question was to do with how a lot of Margaret River properties have got bush on them already, or other plantings, whether they be, I don't know, plums or potentially eucalypts. How far back can we go to access any credits from those in terms of time, or can it only be for new plantings? And what happens after 25 years anyway?
Yeah, this is probably a great question for Dan, but I'll just put my perspective on it. It depends a little bit with the trees. If you're going to try and claim the activity as a carbon project through the government level, and with the Australian government as a registered tree planting or biodiversity planting, that would need that element of newness. But Dan can probably talk a little bit better about that, and whether there's some kind of grandfathering of other plantings if you're not looking for that certification.
Yeah, so with the climate active scheme, which is the one that you might consider using for offsetting your own emissions, the new tree planting, which is what Joe was talking about, newness or additionality. So that's that's probably the key terms with a lot of these carbon projects is things have to be done that weren't, business as usual beforehand. So if you had done a planning project from 1990 onwards, then you've got the potential, 1990, you've got the potential of using that in an in-setting or a climate active registered project. If you want to sell a credit, then generally that project has to have been initiated in the last 10 years. So, and it's interesting because I guess in the only state I know of is New South Wales, where you can go and, have a look at an existing piece of bush that you have on your property and assess its condition and do something to improve it and get paid for it as an environmental offset. So that might be through removing feral animals, weeds, anything that improves bush condition you can get credited for over there, and someone who's removing bush on a different project can use that as a, in inverted commas, offset. But I don't think you can do that yet in Western Australia. But I suspect that with the emergence of what's called the nature repair market, which is the legislation which was introduced at the start of this year to help financing, incentivising improvement in nature nationwide, there will be some mechanism in that encourages stewardship of something that you already own. But I wouldn't want to say too much about that at this stage until it actually becomes clearer.
With that sort of, Dan, and in terms of biodiversity, could you start your own record keeping now? If you're saying like you have a window of 10 years, and say you've got an area of remnant bush, but underneath that bush it's quite biodiverse, sort of low, you could start your own record keeping now and then map your improvement in biodiversity over a period of time and have that as a document of evidence that maybe when this changes come in that could be used potentially?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, that's worth thinking about, and that's something that I'll probably have to consider a little bit more, because I guess in a carbon project setting, some people are getting caught out because they've done work or they've done some activity to improve things before they've registered a project, and sometimes that's not included in the project because of that newness or additionality clause that me and Joe were talking about beforehand. But I think, when you can go out and start benchmarking and measuring things, that's the first step in any of these projects. And to establish a baseline is really important because, the flip side is that you get into a project and you've done all these things that have basically brought that environment back to, let's say it was C grade beforehand and now it's B or A grade. And if you've gone in there and you set up your project when the site is A grade, then you've got very little room for getting rewarded for the effort that you've put in to improve that natural asset. So I think, if I can, I'm just going to consider that and get back to the group. But I think, the sooner you can, now that these things are formally hitting the market, the sooner you can get in and start doing activities or creating logs or records, including photos. And some of the things we're putting into projects are things like, acoustic monitoring devices or any sort of verifiable record that you can capture, which, for example, verifies that you've got presence of a threatened species or you've got some, developing ecological community or any of that sort of stuff, is all the things that get measured and validated and valued in some way or other these types of initiatives. So yeah, I think it's valuable.
I mean, and speaking further to that, there is evidence on properties in the Margaret River region where they've actually had government sort of surveys of the catchment regions and papers done on those to sort of look at the degradation across those catchments. And then properties have gone in and done some amazing work. And you can see through, say, a document that was released in the early 2000s to now, that improvement that they have invested in that, both in biodiversity as well as sort of, I guess, a form of sequestration. You can't backdate it that far, could you?
Again, like let me fact check, but you know, all this stuff is relevant in, you know, aspects of SWA reporting. I know that you know, when you're a larger organisation, you're definitely getting asked these days about you know, what natural assets you have on site and what you're doing to improve them. So being able to measure and quantify and verify things is important. But yeah, how far back you can actually, I think that the fact that you've got documentation and it's independent is of high value, but how you can actually leverage that, let me have a look at it and maybe I can get back to the group as a whole.
Yeah, I might just speak to that a little bit. And from my perspective, my suggestion would be to say, if you've got remnant vegetation or biodiversity work you're doing, that is incredibly marketable and has value. It's probably not the easiest way to go if you've already had those activities starting. It's not the easiest way to go and claim any carbon inset for it. My perspective on it would be certainly from the soil carbon space, but also in this in what they call environmental planting space, you're better to start with a completely new activity if you're looking to do it for the purpose of carbon insetting against your operation. It's much cleaner and simpler. That doesn't make it always practical in terms of environmental planting, but the scenario that we talked about with Hither and Yon over here around, they had an unproductive vineyard that had reached the end of its life. They were uncertain about the desire to plant that particular variety again, and instead they said, well, what can we do with this area that's going to help us reduce our bill at the end of the year in buying credits to offset emissions? What can we do to save ourselves a bill if we turn that area into a revegetation area and at the same time try and improve soil carbon across the board? And so I guess that might be applicable for some of you if you have areas of vineyard that are no longer productive or are coming out of production. How would that then open up an opportunity to put that to environmental plantings to then start a new project that's registered with the government for credits that you can use to offset your own emissions? That's the opportunity, I think, that's there for the wine industry in some places.
Dan, yeah.
Two questions. One, the modelling that you've done with regards to soil carbon projects, where are you at with verifying that?
Where are we up to with what, sorry?
Verification, because anecdotally my understanding is that soil carbon is not increasing in a straight line. If you're getting hot seasons, you might be oxidising soil carbon off.
Sure.
So the modelling, and particularly with the soil carbon projects, the fact that you are earning ACCUs based on actual measurement, how does the verification match up with the modelling that you've done?
So the case study that we did, where we had to put, because we only measured in the last 6 months, in order to perform this case study, we had to do some assumptions around what we could foreseeably build. But you're absolutely right. We looked at that number and said, well, that's conservatively what the scientific literature is saying you can build in soils with that kind of rainfall, with going from intensive agriculture or tilling practices over to permanent pasture, and that kind of the scenario that is very popular here in South Australia. But yes, you're right that there's the carbon that's in that system, a large fraction of it is what we call labile. It's being oxidized, being consumed. And that's why with the soil projects, they rely on that empirical measurement, that actual physical resampling of the soil and the number that you get at the end of that testing to calculate the build of carbon. Whereas with trees, they're happy to go with more of a system where you can use the model alone to estimate what carbon's been sequestered, provided those trees and those plantings have survived. And they use satellite imagery to actually verify that. And in some cases, they require physical audits to happen out in that space as well. Does that answer the question there? I understand you're concerned about how confident we can be in those numbers.
Well, I guess at the risk of being the capitalist in the room, it's a dollars and cents question. So if the modelling isn't being verified, then it's a little bit more of a leap of faith in terms of producers committing to these projects. The second part of the question is, given the numbers that you're projecting and modelling, is there a property size or project size below which it's no longer profitable or no longer financially viable to undertake? Is there an economy of scale that you have to generate?
Yeah, there definitely is. I think if you're looking to build carbon units for sale on the market and not looking to inset them against your own business, then certainly anything less than 100 hectares of soil project is probably not worth looking at, just because the costs associated with doing the sampling and setting up the development costs of the project and then the resampling before the credits are issued would far outweigh what the value is worth. But in terms of what it's worth to you as a business, if you're insetting, while you might not recover the total cost, what you're doing is gradually chipping away at what your expense would be if you're buying credits on the market. So yes, certainly in the project that's been registered with Treasury, they're at a point where what they've spent on developing that project, those costs will not be fully recovered with the size of the vineyard that they have lodged. But they're looking at it from the perspective of, this is there to reduce our emissions on that site in line with their target. So they're looking at this and saying, well, we expect there's going to be a cost. If we can recover a portion of that cost in terms of insetting rather than having to buy offsets, then that was sufficient for them.
No worries, thank you.
Yeah, great question though. I think that's important to keep in mind around, what is likely to be able to be produced in that space. And that's where you would say, take this information as a bit of a guide of what we could prepare for these 5 sites, but then you really need to work with someone if you're going to go down this path in that project development space to get some very, very accurate numbers around what they think your carbon abatement could be in the future, which basically means what are you likely to be able to build. Yeah, great. Any other questions?
Yes, yep, Larissa?
What about the vines themselves, say in full production, like as a component measurement?
Like planting a vineyard from scratch, or?
No, once fully established.
Yeah.
During growth season, like production.
The trees under 1.3
Yeah.
I couldn't hear all the question, but
I think it was, I guess, is there the possibility of using the life cycle of a vine for carbon within your business, your property, the life cycle of a vine as carbon offsetting, I guess?
I love that question. The short answer is currently no, but my mind goes there as well, because essentially they are sequestering carbon. But as far as being able to register it for carbon units, currently there's no method in place for that. Dan, do you have anything you want to add?
Yeah, so what's happening in places like California is they do have a registered method or a formal way of recognising the carbon sequestered by almond trees. In New Zealand, they're considering developing a method for other tree crops as well, including olives. There's companies in Australia at the moment who are looking and considering what their captured carbon is in their horticultural settings as well. So, as Joe said, there is no formal methodology at the moment, but what there is from the Australian government is an invitation for different groups, different industries to put together and submit, methodologies that they think are valid for their industry in regards to carbon capture and offsetting. So just because there isn't one at the moment doesn't mean that one can't be developed. So I'm sure if there was enough of an industry push or a collaboration, one would imagine that there is, significant amount of carbon being sequestered by vines. So there might even be some literature out there which sort of backs that up already. So I think it'd really be, the onus on industry to pull their resources and to have a look at this and have a look at what literature already exists. And it wouldn't surprise me, but Julian might be able to tell us whether, some of that free work is being done by Wine Australia already. So that's a long way of saying no, but it's also a short way of saying maybe.
I have a question.
Yep.
How much of an advantage do you think that it is for the wine industry or the grape growing industry having perennial plants and, not having to do tillage or like broadacre? How much of an advantage is that to us in terms of soil carbon credits and insetting?
Well, certainly the capacity for soils to build organic carbon is much higher when you go away from a tillage system. I guess it depends a little bit on how recently the farming has been in a system of what we call permanent pasture. If it was in the last 10 years, a broad, like a cropping system or heavily grazed, and then it was transitioned into permanent row plantings with permanent cover, then you're in a very good spot to be able to start to build carbon from your baseline. But the biggest drivers are really around soil texture and soil moisture. So you can have systems which are not tilled at all, but if you don't have sufficient clay content, you don't have sufficient rainfall, the rate of gain of organic carbon is going to be very slow. I don't know that it's a very cut and dry answer or a cut and dry way of looking at the problem, but certainly what we are in a position of advantage with in permanent row systems like vineyards is that we don't need to go and do those things which encourage the oxidation of organic carbon we already have there. So what that means is the organic carbon that's in the ground right now, we're in a better position to have that stay in the system of cycling, and some of it becoming consumed and some of it being used to further build soil health, and a fraction of it remaining as organic carbon that we can measure improve over time. We're not doing those things where we're tilling and exposing that to the atmosphere, where it basically is degraded and volatilizes and disappears from our system. So that's the advantage that we have in the permanent row space, is your rate of growth is going to be dependent a bit about on your site and your particular project, but you're in a position to minimize losses.
Anyone else? All right, I think that's it, guys.
Awesome.
So
Thank
just
you.
massive thank you for that today. I found that so interesting and so informative, and a lot of food for thought for everyone here. So thank you so much for taking the time.
No worries.
You're
Pleasure.
welcome. Yep, and you'll have access to this information afterwards as well through Kate. So by all means, if you have any follow-up questions, you're welcome to get in touch with either of us about it. Hopefully that's kind of looked at two of the main things you can do as a wine or grape producer if you're looking to inset against your own emissions, that being building soil carbon and building carbon sequestered through plantings. Thank you.